The sun hung low over the dry plains of the Texas frontier. The wind stirred the dust, creating faint trails of sand that rolled like whispers across the land. On a dusty ranch, miles from the nearest town, Elijah Carter, a weathered rancher in his early 40s, stood leaning against the wooden fence of his property, his gaze distant, searching the horizon as the day's heat faded. Elijah was a man hardened by years of solitude. Since his wife's death a decade ago, he had carried the weight of the land alone. The ranch had once been a family dream, but now it was just a quiet existence, a place where time seemed to stop for everyone except him. His days were filled with cattle, chores, and the occasional visit to town, rarely anything that would interrupt the rhythm of his isolated life. But that day, the quiet was broken by a faint sound from the dirt road. A small figure, barely more than child, appeared on the horizon, riding a pony too large for their frame. The sun cast a shadow over the stranger, making it difficult to see the face until they drew closer. Elijah squinted against the light, trying to make out the figure as it approached. The rider's small frame and ragged clothes spoke of hardship, and as the rider neared, Elijah saw the dirt-streaked face of a boy, no older than 15, with wide, frightened eyes. The boy halted in front of the fence, his eyes darting nervously between Elijah and the dirt road behind him. Elijah's eyes narrowed, assessing the boy's condition. The torn clothes, the dust caked into his hair, the anxious way he held the reins. The boy shifted uneasily on the pony, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a crumpled envelope. He handed it over without a word, his hands shaking as they passed the letter to the rancher. Elijah took the envelope, his brow furrowing as he noticed the familiar handwriting on the front. His late wife's cousin, a woman who had lived in the nearest town. He had not seen her in years. "Who sent this?" Elijah asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart raced slightly at the sight of the letter. The boy hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. She said you'd know what to do with it. "Please, sir, I've been told to give it to you." Elijah looked at the boy for a long moment, then tore open the envelope. The letter inside was written hastily. The ink smudged in places, as if the writer had been in a hurry. His heart sank as he read the words aloud. "Elijah, I know you've heard the rumors, but I've got to tell you the truth. The land you own isn't what you think. There's something buried beneath it, something you can't imagine. Please, come to town, and you'll learn the truth about everything. But be careful. They've been watching you." Elijah's grip tightened around the letter. His mind raced with questions, none of which made sense. What was hidden on his land? Why had his wife's cousin left this warning for him, of all people? And who was they that had been watching him? The wind picked up, howling across the empty plains. Elijah's thoughts spun like the dust swirling around him. He looked down at the boy, whose eyes were filled with fear, waiting for a response. Elijah nodded, handing him the letter. "Go back to town," Elijah said, his voice firm. "Tell your people I'll be there tomorrow. And thank you." The boy nodded, then quickly turned his pony around and galloped back toward the distant town, leaving Elijah standing in the silence of his ranch. As the boy disappeared into the distance, Elijah felt the weight of the letter in his hand, like an anchor pulling him into unknown waters. He had lived on this land for years, but now something felt different. Something was about to change forever. The town of Pine Ridge wasn't much more than a handful of buildings clustered around a single dusty street, but it was a place where rumors spread faster than a prairie fire, and Elijah Carter had been the subject of many whispers in recent months. Elijah rode into town the following morning, the sound of hooves ringing in the quiet morning air. His mind was still heavy with the cryptic letter and the boy's fearful eyes. He had no idea what awaited him, but something told him that the truth was more complicated than he could imagine. As Elijah tied his horse to the post outside the general store, he noticed a man leaning against the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. His worn leather jacket and dusty hat spoke of a man who had spent too many years on the road. The stranger's gaze followed Elijah as he stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his holster. The man's eyes seemed to weigh him with every step. "You're the rancher," the stranger said, his voice rough but steady. Elijah didn't answer immediately. His instincts screamed that something was off, But he kept his voice calm. "What do you want?" "I hear you've been looking for answers," the stranger continued, pushing off the porch and taking a step closer. "Answers about your land, about your wife's cousin. It's not what you think. Elijah." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. The man knew more than he should. He had to know if this man was a threat or someone who could offer him the truth he was searching for. "You've got 5 minutes," Elijah said, his voice calm but edged with tension. "Start talking." The stranger smirked, clearly not intimidated. "Your wife's cousin left out a few details. She wasn't just warning you about buried secrets. She was trying to stop something far worse from happening. And now it's too late." As the stranger spoke, Elijah's mind reeled. What did he mean it was too late? What secrets could his late wife's cousin have been hiding? And why hadn't she told him sooner? "I'll take you to where it all started," the stranger said, his voice lowering. "But be prepared. Once you know the truth, there's no going back." Elijah had no choice. He needed answers. The stranger led him to a cabin on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and hidden by overgrown weeds. The air smelled of dust and decay. The stranger pushed open the creaky door, revealing a room filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. "This is where it began," the stranger said. "Your wife's cousin was part of something bigger, Elijah. She was protecting something, someone from the land, from the past. But now it's your turn to decide what happens next." Elijah's thoughts were a blur. He looked around the cabin, half expecting to see something out of place. And then his eyes fell upon a small chest hidden in the corner. "Open it," the stranger urged. Elijah moved cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The chest creaked as he lifted the lid, revealing a stack of letters and papers, documents that could change everything. He pulled out the top letter and began reading, his hands trembling. The letter spoke of a land deed, of a hidden treasure buried beneath his ranch, and of a bloodline tied to something far older than the town of Pine Ridge. The stranger's voice cut through his thoughts. "You see, Elijah, this isn't just about land. It's about what's buried beneath it, and who wants it." Elijah stared at the documents, his mind racing. His entire life had been built on this land, but now everything he knew was in question. The stranger stood silently beside him, waiting for Elijah to make his decision. "You have a choice," the stranger said, his voice low. "You can keep what's yours, or you can take what's been hidden. But be careful, Elijah. The truth is a heavy burden. It'll change everything." Elijah's hand tightened around the papers. He had always been a man of the land, but now the choice before him wasn't just about ownership. It was about protecting the future. His thoughts turned to the boy who had delivered the letter, to the promises his late wife's cousin had made, and to the ranch that had been his sanctuary. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but Elijah knew there was no going back. "I'll protect what's mine," Elijah said, his voice steady, resolute. "But I'll do it on my terms." The stranger nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of respect. "Then the choice is made, and the consequences will follow." As Elijah left the cabin, the weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. He had chosen the path that would define his future, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance as Elijah rode back to his ranch. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain. The secrets of the land had been unearthed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was setting behind the jagged hills, casting long, amber shadows across the land. Elijah Carter's horse moved steadily, each hoofbeat thudding against the dry ground. Yet there was a weight in the air that even the dust couldn't settle. Elijah hadn't fully processed the documents he'd found in the hidden chest, but the gravity of what he'd uncovered had already begun to shift the foundation of his reality. His ranch had been his sanctuary. It had been a constant, a place where he could hide from the world's cruelty, where the land was familiar and the routine comforting. But now, that same land was suddenly steeped in a shadow of mystery and danger. The letter had spoken of a treasure buried beneath the very ranch he had spent so many years cultivating. And that treasure wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more dangerous. The stranger had mentioned a bloodline tied to the land, a legacy that no one had spoken of until now. What was it? And why had his wife's cousin, of all people, chosen to protect this secret. As Elijah approached his ranch, the familiar sight of the barn and farmhouse did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but the endless stretch of prairie, silent and still. Elijah dismounted and tied his horse to the post. The ranch seemed eerily quiet. Even the wind had stilled, as if waiting for something to break the silence. He walked to the door of the farmhouse, pausing for a moment. The house, with its weathered wood and faded shutters, was where he had spent countless nights alone, where he had tried to bury his grief. But now there was no escaping it. Whatever was buried in that letter was now a part of his life. The choice he had made would change everything. As Elijah entered the house, his boots echoed against the wooden floorboards, a hollow sound in the silence. He had hoped to find peace tonight, but his thoughts kept returning to the stranger's words. The truth will change everything. What did he mean by that? Elijah sat down at the old oak table, the one he had shared meals at with his late wife, and spread the documents out before him. His fingers brushed over the letter, tracing the faint ink. The language was cryptic, but it was clear enough to know that there was something important buried beneath the land. It wasn't long before the sound of hooves reached his ears, a rider approaching fast. Elijah's hand instinctively went to the gun at his hip. His instincts told him something was wrong. He hadn't heard anyone coming up the road, and it was far too late for casual visitors. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The silhouette of a rider was visible against the dusky sky, a lone figure riding hard, dust trailing behind them. The rider drew closer, and Elijah's heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. It was the boy, the one who had delivered the letter to him, the same frightened look in his eyes. The boy reined in his horse, panting, his face pale from the journey. "Mr. Carter," the boy gasped. "They're coming. They found out what you know. They're coming for you." Elijah's stomach tightened. "Who's coming?" The boy looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. "The men, the ones your cousin warned you about. They found out you know about the treasure. They'll be here by sunrise." Elijah's pulse quickened. He had only just begun to uncover the truth, and already trouble was on its way. He needed answers, but time was running out. That night, Elijah sat alone in the dim light of the farmhouse. The documents spread out before him. He could hear the wind howling outside, the sound of the prairie shifting in the dark. His thoughts raced, but he couldn't seem to find a clear path forward. There was a treasure buried beneath his land. There were men coming to take it. And somehow, his life had become intertwined with a bloodline he knew nothing about. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood quickly, his instincts kicking in. He hadn't expected anyone else tonight. When he opened the door, he found the last person he expected to see. Standing there in the doorway, silhouetted by the soft light of the cabin, was a woman, tall, strong, with dark eyes and a weary face. She was wearing a worn leather coat, her long, dark hair braided tightly behind her head. She was a stranger to him, but the way she looked at him with intensity and purpose stirred something deep inside. "You're Elijah Carter?" she asked, her voice steady but low. "I am," he replied, narrowing his eyes. "Who are you?" "My name's Lila," she said, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. "I've come to warn you. They're already on their way. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." Elijah stood there for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What was this woman's connection to the men coming for him? And how did she know about the treasure buried beneath his land? Lila stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not here to take what's yours, but you've got a decision to make. They'll stop at nothing to get to the land. They'll kill for it if they have to." Elijah's gaze softened as he studied her, searching for some sign of truth. The night was thick with tension, and the moment seemed to stretch endlessly. He had heard rumors, whispers of men who would do anything to claim what was rightfully theirs. But hearing it from her made it real. "I'm not afraid of them," Elijah said, his voice steady. Lila met his gaze. "It's not about fear, Elijah. It's about survival. You're going to have to choose. Either protect the land and what's buried beneath it, or let them take it all." The weight of her words settled into Elijah's chest like a stone. There was no running from this. Whatever had been hidden on this land was his responsibility now. "I'll make my choice," Elijah said, his voice firm. "But I'll need your help." Lila's expression softened slightly. "You're not alone in this. I know what's at stake, and I'll help you protect it." Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. The land, the treasure, the bloodline. It was all part of a story that had been written long before he arrived. But now, it was his turn to write the next chapter. As Elijah stood there with Lila, looking out into the darkened night, the sound of distant hooves echoed across the plain. The men were coming, and Elijah's decision would soon be tested. Would he protect the land, or would he let the past swallow him whole? The night air was thick with the scent of dry earth and the whisper of the wind across the prairie. Elijah Carter stood on the porch of his farmhouse, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. The promise Lila had made to help him protect his land weighed heavily on him. But even her comforting words couldn't calm the storm that raged within him. As Lila moved to secure the windows and doors, Elijah's thoughts raced. The treasure buried beneath his land, a treasure tied to an unknown bloodline, was more than just gold or silver. It was a legacy, a key to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. But the question that haunted him now was simple. What had his late uncle gotten into? And why hadn't anyone spoken of this until now? The sound of hooves in the distance pulled Elijah from his thoughts. He turned toward the horizon, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened landscape. There were no stars tonight, only the dim glow of the moon casting long shadows across the valley. The riders were close, their silhouettes barely visible in the dark. He knew who they were, and he knew why they were coming. Lila emerged from the house, her dark eyes narrowing as she joined him on the porch. "They're close," she said, her voice steady. "And they're not alone." Elijah's heart pounded. He had heard rumors about a group of men who had been tracking him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, that moment had arrived. "We need to move fast," Elijah said, turning to Lila. "Do you have a plan?" Lila nodded, a hard edge to her expression. "We'll make our stand here, but you're going to have to trust me. I know the land better than they do. We'll use the terrain to our advantage." Elijah hesitated for a moment, then gave a sharp nod. He was a rancher, not a fighter. He dealt with cattle, weather, and the isolation of the land, but he wasn't a man who sought conflict. Now, though, he had no choice but to face it head-on. The wind picked up, howling through the plains as Elijah and Lila made their way to the barn. They moved swiftly, their boots thudding against the earth, the sound of hooves drawing closer with every passing second. The barn, with its weathered timbers and cracked walls, seemed like the only safe place to make a stand. Lila led the way, her eyes darting around, scanning for any signs of movement. Elijah followed closely behind, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Every sense heightened. The barn door creaked in the wind as they pushed it open, stepping into the darkness inside. "Stay close," Lila whispered, her voice low but urgent. "If they're coming from the west, they'll use the ridge to cover their approach." Elijah's heart raced as he tried to steady his breath. He had heard of men who had no mercy, men who would kill for money, for power, for greed. And now, those men were coming for him. Lila moved swiftly, setting up a few makeshift barricades with hay bales and broken crates. Elijah stood watch, his gaze flicking toward the horizon, where the sound of hooves was now deafening. There were at least 5 riders, maybe more, closing in on them. Then the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot rang out, breaking the tension in the air. It was followed by the galloping of hooves, as the riders revealed themselves, appearing at the top of the ridge. They were coming fast. "Elijah," Lila said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Get ready. We won't get another chance." Elijah's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wasn't a man who had ever been forced to take another's life. But now, with his land and his future on the line, there was no turning back. He drew his revolver, taking a deep breath as he peered over the edge of the hay bale. He could see the riders now, the dust swirling around them like a storm. They were coming hard, their horses pounding across the earth, their rifles gleaming in the moonlight. Elijah raised his gun, his hand steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. He had no choice. He had to protect what was his. The tension was unbearable, the seconds stretching longer than Elijah thought possible. His eyes flicked between Lila, who was crouched low, and the riders, who were now only a few hundred yards away. The sound of their approach was deafening, their horses' hooves shaking the ground beneath Elijah's feet. It felt as though the world had stopped moving, leaving only this moment to define his fate. Then, without warning, one of the riders pulled ahead, drawing his rifle. The man was tall, dark-haired, and wearing a black bandana around his neck. Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot rang out. It was Lila who fired, her aim true as a rider fell from his horse. The rest of the riders scrambled in confusion, but Lila didn't give them time to recover. She fired again, and another rider fell. Elijah's heart raced as the chaos unfolded before him. He hadn't expected Lila to be so quick, so efficient. He had underestimated her. But now, he knew she wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a force to be reckoned with. The remaining riders began to circle the barn, trying to find an opening. They were smarter than Elijah had anticipated, their strategy clear. They intended to wear them down, force them to come out into the open. Elijah gritted his teeth, his revolver steady in his hand. He would not go down without a fight. As the riders closed in, Elijah could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about his survival, and the survival of everything he had fought for. And with every shot that rang out, the stakes grew higher. Then, another rider appeared, a tall figure cloaked in darkness, riding toward them with the speed of a storm. Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the rider's face. Someone from his past, someone who he had never expected to see again. Elijah Carter, the man called out, his voice rough and familiar. Elijah's hand trembled as he gripped his revolver. His mind raced, trying to piece together the face that had suddenly reappeared from the shadows of his past. The man riding toward them wasn't just any outlaw. No, this was someone who had known him long ago, someone who had left a trail of chaos behind him and had disappeared as quickly as he came. The rider's silhouette was framed by the pale moonlight, his horse's hooves striking the earth with a purposeful rhythm. As he drew closer, Elijah could see the weathered face and cold eyes of the man. The black bandana tied around his neck fluttered in the breeze. Jesse Miller. Elijah muttered under his breath, a mixture of shock and anger twisting his gut. Lila's sharp eyes flicked between the rider and Elijah, sensing the change in the air. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Elijah didn't answer immediately. The weight of the past had come crashing down on him. Jesse Miller had been a part of a gang of raiders who terrorized the region a decade ago. He had vanished without a trace, leaving destruction and heartache behind him. But now he was back, and Elijah had no doubt that his return meant trouble. Jesse pulled his horse to a stop just outside the barn, his gaze locking onto Elijah with a mixture of recognition and disdain. Well, if it isn't Elijah Carter, still playing the noble rancher. Huh? Elijah stood tall, not giving an inch. "What do you want, Jesse?" His voice was steady, though the fire inside him was building. He hadn't survived this long, only to let someone like Jesse Miller take everything he had worked for. "I'm not here for your land," Jesse said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "I'm here for something more valuable." Lila's hand shot out, gripping Elijah's arm. "Elijah, don't. He's dangerous." Elijah's eyes never left Jesse. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him, not again. "Whatever you're after, you'll have to take it from me." Jesse chuckled, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. "You always were a stubborn one, Carter. But this time, you're not in control. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies." Elijah's blood ran cold at the threat. He knew the type of man Jesse was. He had no qualms about taking lives, if it meant getting what he wanted. "I won't let you harm her," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, the weight of his promise hanging between them. Lila's eyes widened, her hand still gripping his arm. She knew what he was saying, and for the first time, she saw a side of Elijah she hadn't fully understood until now, the side that would fight and die for something, or someone he cared about. Jesse's grin widened, the scar on his cheek pulling tight as he spoke. And what will you do to stop me, Carter? You're outnumbered. You and your little lady are about to become part of my collection. Elijah's jaw clenched. He wouldn't let Jesse have the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. You're making a mistake. The standoff stretched, neither side willing to make the first move. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors, the dust swirling around them like a storm waiting to break. Then, with a sharp motion, Jesse reached for his revolver, drawing it in one fluid motion. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had seconds, less than that, to make a move. Before he could react, Lila's hand shot out, her own gun raised, and in an instant a sharp, loud crack shattered the silence. Jesse staggered back, a shocked expression flashing across his face. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, and though it wasn't a fatal wound, it was enough to knock him off balance. Lila didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, covering the distance between them in a matter of seconds, her gun aimed at Jesse's chest. "You don't get to decide who lives, Jesse," she said, her voice colder than the night air. "Not anymore." Jesse's eyes widened in disbelief. He had underestimated her. Elijah could see that. But it wasn't just Lila's quick reflexes that had thrown him off balance. It was a quiet strength and determination that now shone in her eyes, the resolve to protect herself and the ranch. For a brief moment, there was silence. Jesse's hand hovered over his gun, but he made no move to draw it again. His eyes flicked between Elijah and Lila, calculating, trying to figure out his next move. "You've changed, Lila," Jesse said slowly, his voice filled with venom. "But I'm still the same man. I'll take what I want, whether you like it or not." "Not tonight," Elijah replied, his voice hard. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Jesse and Lila. "You've already lost." Jesse sneered, and with a sudden, desperate move, he lunged toward Elijah, his hand reaching for his revolver. But Lila was faster. Her gun cracked once more, and this time the shot rang true. Jesse collapsed to the ground, his revolver slipping from his hand. He didn't make a sound, his body crumpling in the dust like a rag doll. Lila lowered her gun, her breath heavy as she took a step back. Elijah stood over Jesse's body, his own gun still raised but steady. The silence was deafening. Elijah's pulse hammered in his ears, but his mind was already racing, thinking about the next move, about what was to come. Lila looked at Elijah, her face pale but resolute. "He's gone." Elijah nodded, his grip tightening on his revolver. "It's not over yet. We've still got work to do." Lila's eyes met his, and for a moment there was no need for words. They both understood. The danger wasn't just gone because Jesse was dead. It was still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, they had won a small victory. Elijah turned to the barn door, his gaze sweeping across the valley. There was more to this story than just Jesse Miller. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of his land, something that could change everything. The moonlight glinted off something in the distance, just beyond the barn. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Another rider? Or was it something more sinister lurking in the darkness? He turned back to Lila. "Stay inside. I've got this." Lila nodded, her face grim. "Be careful." As Elijah stepped into the night, the sound of hooves reached his ears again. But this time, it wasn't just one rider. The game was only beginning. The night air was thick with tension as Elijah stepped into cold, the moon high above casting a ghostly glow over the land. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he moved toward the sound of approaching hooves. He didn't know who it was, but he had a feeling it wasn't a friendly face. After everything with Jesse Miller, he knew the danger hadn't passed. It never did in the Wild West. The rider came into view, his silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. It wasn't just one man. There were two. The first was a tall figure, draped in a dark cloak. The second shorter, but no less menacing. They moved with purpose, the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves breaking the stillness of the valley. Elijah's hand rested on the handle of his revolver. His instincts told him to be ready. He didn't trust anyone anymore. Not after Jesse, not after the events of the last few days. He'd learned the hard way that people didn't just disappear in the Wild West. They always came back. The The riders stopped just beyond the barn. Elijah could see their faces now, weathered, hardened. The taller man dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. His face was scarred, eyes cold as steel. "I know you," Elijah called out, his voice steady despite the knot of tension that twisted in his gut. He took a step forward, keeping his hand close to his gun. "What do you want?" The taller man grinned, the moonlight catching the jagged scar across his cheek. "You do know me, Elijah Carter. We go way back, don't we?" Elijah's heart skipped. The name was familiar, but the face, he couldn't place it. His mind raced, searching through the fog of his past, trying to remember the details. "I don't have time for games," Elijah growled. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I want what's mine." Elijah's hand tightened around the revolver. "I don't owe you anything." The second rider dismounted, and as he approached, Elijah saw the glint of a badge. A lawman, but he wasn't the kind of lawman Elijah trusted. "You owe a lot more than you think, Carter," the lawman said, his voice low and menacing. "You and your land." Lila's face flashed in Elijah's mind. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. If these men were here for his land, they were after something bigger, and they weren't going to stop until they had it. The taller man took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "I know you've been hiding something, and I'm here to collect." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "I'm not hiding anything. You'd be better off leaving before things get ugly." The lawman chuckled darkly. "Things already got ugly the moment you decided to stand in our way." Elijah took a deep breath, calculating his next move. He had no intention of letting these men take anything from him. Not his land, not his future with Lila, and certainly not his freedom. "We'll see about that," Elijah said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Before the taller man could react, Elijah drew his revolver in a smooth, practiced motion. The lawman was quicker, but not quick enough. Elijah fired, the gunshot echoing in the stillness of the night. The lawman's hand shot to his side, his face twisting in shock as he crumpled to the ground. The taller man spun around, reaching for his own weapon, but Elijah was already on the move. He rushed forward, his boots pounding against the earth as he tackled the man to the ground. They grappled in the dust, rolling over each other in a blur of fists and curses. The man was strong, but Elijah had the advantage of anger for the betrayal he'd faced, for the life he was trying to build. The man broke free momentarily, reaching for his gun, but Elijah was faster. He slammed the barrel of his revolver into the man's temple, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, Elijah stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The fight was over for now, but he knew this wasn't the end. There would be more men, more threats. He had to be ready for whatever came next. He turned back toward the barn, his gaze flicking to Lila, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. "Elijah," she called softly, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" Elijah nodded slowly, but his mind was still racing. "For now." He stepped toward her, his eyes softening. "But we need to leave. They'll be back. And next time, they won't stop until they get what they want." Lila stepped forward, her hand reaching out to him. "What do we do now?" Elijah's gaze hardened as he looked out toward the horizon. "We fight, and we protect what's ours." The night stretched on and the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of more danger. But Elijah was ready. Whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't back down. The story was far from over. And Elijah Carter wasn't about to lose everything he had fought for. As Elijah and Lila prepared to leave, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. More riders, more trouble. Elijah's hand gripped the revolver at his side, ready for whatever came next. The wind picked up, swirling dust through the barren land as Elijah stood beside Lila, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The echo of hooves grew louder, unmistakable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hand tightened around his revolver, every muscle in his body tense, ready for what was to come. Lila stood close, her brow furrowed, eyes scanning the distance. "They're coming, aren't they?" Elijah nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "They never stop. Not now, not ever. The riders crested the hill, their figures silhouetted against the twilight sky. There were at least 6 of them, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they moved toward the ranch. Elijah's heart sank. This was no ordinary group of men. It was an army of greed, a collection of hired guns, each one with a price on their head and blood on their hands. Lila stepped closer to him, her hand brushing against his. "What do we do, Elijah? We can't fight all of them." He turned to her, his face softening for a moment. "We'll do what we can, but we don't have to do it alone." He glanced at the barn, where the horses were stabled, and then at the small house that had been his home for the past few years. It wasn't much, but it was all he had, and it was Lila's now, too. There was no way he was going to let these men take it from her. The riders were getting closer, their faces still obscured by the dark, but Elijah could see their weapons glinting in the fading light. They were armed to the teeth, ready for a fight, and from the way they moved, it was clear they were here to make a statement. One of the riders, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, rode ahead of the rest. His horse's hooves drummed steadily against the earth, as though he was the leader of the group. He was the first to speak. "Carter," he called out, his voice carrying through the still air. "I know you're out here. You can't hide forever." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He simply stood tall, his back straight, watching the man. The rider pulled his horse to a stop just a few yards away. "I'm not hiding," Elijah finally said, his voice low and steady. "And I'm not running. What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I want what's mine," he said, "and I'm going to take it, whether you like it or not." Lila's grip on Elijah's arm tightened. "Elijah, what is he talking about?" Elijah's eyes darkened, a storm of emotion swirling within him. He'd heard that voice before, and he knew exactly who this man was. Jesse Miller. The same man who had come to town years ago with a promise that Elijah had never been able to escape. Miller was the one who had made Elijah's life a living hell, the one who had taken everything from him. "This is between you and me, Miller," Elijah said, his voice cold, a hint of steel in it. "You've already taken enough, but you'll take no more." Miller's smile faded, replaced by a look of disdain. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dirt as he stood facing Elijah. "You're right about one thing, Carter," Miller said, his voice dripping with malice. "You've lost everything. But now, I'm here to make sure you lose everything else. This land," he gestured toward the ranch, "it belongs to me. I've already claimed it. You're just a temporary squatter." Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. He knew this day would come. He'd seen it in his dreams, heard it in the whispers of the wind. But now that it was here, the weight of it was unbearable. "I don't owe you anything," Elijah said, stepping forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "This land belongs to me, and I'm not going to let you take it." Miller raised an eyebrow. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice taunting. "You're just one man. You got nothing left." Lila's hand found Elijah's, and she squeezed it tightly. She had faith in him, faith that he could protect them, faith that he could turn the tide. Elijah's eyes flicked to the barn, where the horses were still being kept, and then to the house. He had no choice. He had to fight. He wasn't going to let this man take the land from him. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything he had built with Lila. "I've got more than you think," Elijah muttered, stepping into position. The tension hung thick in the air, the dust swirling around them. The riders behind Jesse Miller watched intently, waiting for their leader's signal. Elijah knew they wouldn't hesitate to strike if given the order. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. "You're making a mistake, Carter," Miller warned, drawing a pistol from his side. "You won't walk away from this." "Maybe I won't," Elijah said, his voice unwavering. "But neither will you." In the blink of an eye, the 2 men drew their weapons, the sound of the gunshots filling the air. But Elijah was faster. He had been prepared for this moment for years. His hand shot out, his revolver firing in one smooth motion. The bullet struck Miller's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a grunt. The other riders hesitated for a split second, but that was all Elijah needed. He fired again and again. The riders scattered, some fleeing toward their horses, others taking cover behind the rocks and trees. But Elijah wasn't done yet. He couldn't afford to leave any loose ends. "Lila," Elijah called, his voice sharp. "Get inside. Lock the doors." Lila hesitated, fear in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew Elijah's command was final. With one last glance at her, Elijah turned his attention back to the chaos unfolding around him. The battle was just beginning. The riders retreated, but Miller was not finished. His eyes burned with fury as he staggered to his feet, clutching his shoulder. He wouldn't let Elijah walk away unscathed. And Elijah knew deep down that this wasn't over. The night hung heavy in the air, thick with dust and tension. The ranch, once a peaceful refuge, now felt like a battleground. Elijah's heart beat fast, each thud a reminder of what was at stake. He stood outside, his back against a rough-hewn wood of the barn, eyes scanning the horizon. Lila had gone inside, locking herself in as Elijah had ordered. He knew she was safer now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Jesse Miller wouldn't stop, not until he had what he wanted. Elijah had seen it in his eyes, the desperation, the hunger for control. And in that hunger, Miller was dangerous. From the shadows, a low whistle broke the silence. Elijah's body tensed, his hand instinctively gripping the revolver at his side. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The whistling was a familiar sound, one he'd heard countless times before on the battlefield. It was a signal. Behind him, the silhouette of one of Miller's men emerged from the shadows. His tall, broad figure was unmistakable. It was Cole, the same man who had once worked alongside Elijah, but had turned his back on everything they'd fought for. Elijah's jaw clenched at the sight of him, a wave of disgust washing over him. There was no honor in betrayal. "You got some nerve showing up here, Cole," Elijah growled, his voice low but steady. He didn't need to ask what the man was doing here. It was clear. Cole had come to finish what Miller had started. Cole's lips curled into a sneer. "I don't answer to you anymore, Carter. I'm here for the same thing Miller is. Your land, and I'm going to take it one way or another." Elijah's fingers tightened around the revolver, his mind racing. There was no way out of this now. He'd already made a choice. He was going to protect Lila, protect the land. He was ready to make that final stand. But Cole wasn't finished yet. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "You don't get it, do you, Elijah? This land isn't yours. It never was. You were just holding on to it until someone with the guts came to claim it." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You don't know a damn thing about this land. It's more than just dirt and rocks. It's history. It's a future. And it's not for you or anyone else to take." Cole laughed, the sound grating in Elijah's ears. "History? Future? All that's left here is the dust. You're alone, Elijah. Your time's up." With that, Cole drew his gun, the sound of it echoing in the still night air. Elijah was faster. His hand moved in one fluid motion, and the revolver was already in his grip. He fired once, twice. The first bullet grazed Cole's arm, sending him stumbling backward. The second shot found its mark, striking him in the leg. Cole collapsed onto the ground with a howl, his gun falling from his hand. Elijah's eyes didn't leave him. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. But even as Cole writhed in the dirt, Elijah knew this was only a temporary victory. The others would be coming. Miller wouldn't stop. Elijah could feel in the air the weight of everything that had led him here. Another whistle pierced the night. Elijah spun, his eyes scanning the darkness for source. He knew it wasn't over. Miller's men were closing in. This was the beginning of the end. Elijah's mind flashed back to Lila, still inside the ranch. She was safe for now, but if he couldn't hold his ground, it would all be for nothing. With a final glance at Cole, Elijah turned and sprinted for the barn, his boots kicking up dust as he ran. He had to get to Lila, make sure she was protected, but he knew that no matter how fast he moved, there was no escaping what was coming. Miller was going to make sure of that. As Elijah reached the barn door, he saw it, the glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. The next battle had already begun, and this time it was going to be bigger than anything he had faced before. The air inside the barn felt thick with dust and tension as Elijah pushed through the wooden door. He slammed it shut behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. His fingers were slick with sweat, but his grip on the revolver remained steady. Lila stood in the corner of the barn, her eyes wide with fear. She had heard the gunfire, the shouting, and now she saw Elijah, his face hard and determined. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What's going on out there?" Elijah's eyes softened, but the urgency in them was undeniable. "Miller's men are here. They're after the land, Lila, and they won't stop until they get it." Lila took a step forward, her hands trembling at her sides. "What will we do? What if they come for us?" "They will—" Elijah said, his jaw tightening. "But we're not running anymore. This ends tonight." Lila could see the resolve in his eyes. She had seen it before, the same look he had worn when they fought to protect the ranch from the elements, when they pushed through every hardship. She wanted to believe that he could protect them, that they could fight this together, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were outnumbered and outgunned. She didn't have time to voice her concerns, though. The barn door rattled, and Elijah's head snapped toward the sound. It was a faint creak, but it was enough to make him instinctively reach for his gun. "We need to move," Elijah said urgently, his eyes scanning the barn for an escape route. But before he could make a decision, the barn door burst open. Miller's men poured in, rifles raised, their faces cold and determined. Elijah didn't hesitate. His revolver was in his hand, and he aimed it straight at the first man who entered. But before he could fire, a loud crack echoed through the barn, followed by a scream. One of the men fell, clutching his shoulder, as a bullet whizzed by Elijah's ear. The gunfire was deafening. Elijah's heart raced as he ducked behind a haystack, his mind racing. Lila was behind him, her face pale as she crouched low, trying to stay out of the line of fire. "Stay down," Elijah shouted, firing a shot at one of the men advancing toward him. He hit his mark, the man stumbling back with a grunt. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, but Elijah's focus never wavered. He couldn't afford to miss. He couldn't afford to fail. He knew that every shot he fired brought them one step closer to safety, but it also brought them closer to the end. The stakes had never been higher. They were fighting not just for their land, but for their lives. The gunfire slowed, and for a brief moment, there was only silence. Elijah didn't wait to see what would happen next. He sprang into action, moving fast and decisively, his revolver ready. The barn was a battleground, with debris scattered everywhere, broken tools, hay bales overturned, and the scent of smoke hanging in the air. Miller's men were scattered throughout the barn, taking cover where they could, but Elijah was relentless. He saw Lila, crouched in the far corner, and a wave of protectiveness surged through him. He couldn't let anything happen to her, not now, not ever. He turned back toward the group of men, his eyes narrowing as he calculated his next move. There were 5 of them left, and only 3 shots in his revolver. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had faced worse odds before, and he had always come out on top. He took a deep breath and fired again. 1 shot, 1 life. The world seemed to slow as the bullet flew through the air, and Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. Would he survive the battle, or would this be the end? The sound of gunfire still echoed in the barn as Elijah moved toward Lila, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his senses sharp and focused. But the situation was dire. The odds were stacked against them, and time was running out. He saw Lila, crouched low behind a haystack, her face a mix of fear and determination. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for reassurance, but Elijah had none to offer. All he could do was fight. "Elijah," Lila whispered urgently, "we can't keep this up. There are too many of them." "I know," Elijah said, his voice tight, "but we're not giving up. We're not running." He glanced around the barn, mentally mapping out their escape route. The back door was just a few feet away, but there were 2 of Miller's men blocking the path. The front was heavily guarded, and the hay bales were providing little cover now that the fight had escalated. "Elijah," Lila said, her voice trembling, "what do we do now?" Elijah's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't let her down. Not now. Not when they were so close to victory. But there was no way they could keep up the fight forever. They had to act fast. He glanced over at the haystack. He had an idea. One last gamble. A risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But if it worked, it would be their only chance to escape. "Lila, listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, I need you to get to the back door. Take cover and wait for me. Understand?" Lila nodded, her face pale. But there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of trust, a belief that they could still make it out alive. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This was it. It was do or die. He stood up, his revolver aimed at the nearest target, and fired a quick shot. The man collapsed with a grunt, his body hitting the ground with a thud. The remaining men turned toward him, their eyes narrowing in fury. Elijah ducked behind the haystack for cover, his heart racing as he listened to the sound of their footsteps. He could hear the tension in the air, the weight of every moment. He needed more time. He needed to make it count. The men were closing in. Elijah was running out of time. Could he make it to the back door and escape with Lila? Would the final gamble pay off, or would this be the end of their story? The seconds seemed to stretch for Elijah as he dashed toward the back door, the sharp sound of boots behind him growing louder. Each footfall was a reminder that time was running out. He wasn't sure how long he could keep them off Lila or how far she had gotten, but the odds were stacked against them. He wasn't some hero, not the kind you read about in books. He was just a man trying to survive, trying to make sure the woman he loved didn't end up buried beneath the same soil that claimed her family. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he reached the back door, he gripped the handle tightly, but before he could turn it, a voice echoed from behind him. "Don't even think about it." Elijah froze. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable. The same man he had faced earlier, the one with the cold, calculating eyes. The one who'd made it clear that this wasn't just about land. This was personal. "Let her go," Elijah said through clenched teeth. His hand stayed firmly on the door handle. Every muscle in his body tense as he prepared for the inevitable. He would fight if he had to, but he wouldn't go down without a chance to save Lila. A low chuckle came from behind him, and the sound sent a chill down his spine. "You really think I'm going to let you walk away, boy? You crossed too many lines." Elijah's mind raced. The back door was his only shot. But there was no time for a standoff. He had to act now. He spun around, pulling his gun in one fluid motion, aiming at the man who had been following him. He didn't hesitate. A shot rang out, echoing to the narrow hallway of the house, the sound deafening in the stillness. The man staggered back, eyes wide in shock, but Elijah didn't wait to see the results. His heart was racing as he swung the door open, his breath heavy with exertion and fear. He had a moment, a single moment, to get out, and he wasn't about to waste it. But as he stepped into the yard, he realized something. The night had fallen silent. Too silent. The wind had stopped, the world around him holding its breath. And then he heard it. A shot. A loud crack in the stillness. A second later, pain exploded in his side. He gasped, his body jerking forward, his breath leaving in a rush as his legs faltered beneath him. Lila. He spun around, vision blurring, and saw her, standing at the far side of the yard, a figure emerging from the shadows. The same man who had been pursuing them, the one with the cold smile, his gun aimed straight at Lila. "No!" Elijah shouted, but it was too late. His vision was dimming, the pain in his side searing through him as he tried to steady himself. Lila was too close to the gun, too close to danger. "Run!" Elijah shouted, his voice raw with urgency, but the words barely left his mouth before the man stepped forward. Lila stood frozen, eyes wide, not knowing where to go. She had never been trained for this, never been prepared for the violence that Elijah had faced time and time again. She didn't know if she could run, if she could leave her behind to save herself. Her heart told her no, but her mind screamed for her to escape. She couldn't lose him. "Get out of here!" Elijah's voice was a command, raw and desperate, as he staggered forward, the world spinning. The man's gaze flickered from Elijah to Lila, and with a sneer, he raised the gun again. But this time, the shot didn't come from him. A loud crack echoed across the yard, and the man's body jerked backward, a sharp gasp leaving his lips. He collapsed to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. Elijah's heart raced as he tried to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. What the hell had just happened? Had he missed something? Was it another trap? Another gunman? But as the figure in the shadows stepped forward, a sense of relief washed over him. It was Quinn, the outlaw who had been tracking him for weeks. The man who had always been a bit of a wild card, but never an enemy. The same man who had spent days trying to warn him about the coming storm. Quinn had pulled the trigger, taken the shot that saved Elijah's life, and maybe even Lila's. "About time you showed up," Elijah muttered, his voice weak, as he took a step forward. Quinn didn't smile, didn't say anything. He just reached down, holstering his gun as he knelt beside Elijah. "Looks like you could use a hand," Quinn said, his voice steady as ever. "Let's get you somewhere safe." But even as Quinn helped him to his feet, Elijah knew that the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lila and Elijah are still at the mercy of the killers. Quinn's arrival saved them for the moment. But what about the bigger threat? The mystery of the letter, the hidden truth about the ranch, and the secrets lurking in the dark still loom large. The truth was still out there. And no matter how far Elijah ran, the past had a way of catching up. With Quinn's help, they might survive another day. But who could they trust in a world that seemed more like a nightmare every hour? The pain in Elijah's side was unbearable, but it didn't matter. Not now. Not when Lila was still standing there, her heart racing, her face pale as she stared at Quinn, the mysterious stranger who had just saved them. She could barely process what had happened. The shot, the man falling, and then Quinn. She blinked as the events hit her all at once. Who was Quinn really? Why had he helped them? And, more importantly, how could they trust him after everything that had happened? "You're lucky I'm here," Quinn muttered, his grip firm as he steadied Elijah, dragging him away from the blood-soaked earth. "But you can thank me later. Right now, we need to get out of here." The world around them seemed to fade into a blur, the edges of his vision darkening, his body shaking with the strain. Quinn's steady hand was the only thing keeping him upright as he stumbled forward, trying not to fall. But Lila wasn't so sure. She couldn't just blindly trust Quinn, not after everything Elijah had gone through. There was too much mystery surrounding him. The way he knew exactly where they were, the way he seemed to show up just when they were in the most danger. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes flicking between Quinn and the horizon, as if expecting more enemies to peer out of the shadows. "Get to the cabin. Keep your head down," Quinn answered, his eyes never straying from the darkness that surrounded them. He looked like a man who had been through hell and back, but there was something about him, something cold and calculating, that sent a shiver down her spine. "And don't trust anyone else." Lila's heart ached as she glanced down at Elijah, barely able to stand. She'd never imagined her life would spiral into something so dangerous. She had come here hoping for a fresh start, a chance to sell her family's ranch and leave everything behind. But now she was caught in a web of violence, secrets, and lies. With the weight of everything on her shoulders, she stayed close to Elijah as they followed Quinn through the dense brush and toward the shelter of the cabin. Her mind kept returning to that letter, what it said, what it had promised, and why Quinn had come now, at the very moment when Elijah's life hung in the balance. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick with tension. The walls, once full of memories of better days, now seemed to close in on them. Elijah sank into the nearest chair, his hand pressed against the wound at his side, his face pale with pain. Lila stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the darkened landscape outside. The night had fallen heavy, the only sounds of wind rustling through the trees and the distant howl of a coyote. It was eerie, this quiet after the storm. Quinn stepped past her, moving with a familiarity that unsettled her. He knew the cabin, knew how to navigate the shadows. But why had he brought them here? Why hadn't he just left them to fend for themselves? "I need to know what's going on," Lila said, her voice low but firm, as she turned toward him. "You helped us. Why?" Quinn paused at the small table in the center of the room, his back to her. I'm here because it's not over, he said, his voice steady, almost emotionless. There's something bigger at play here. That letter you've got, it's not just a simple message. It's a map, and it's not just leading you to your family's land. It's leading you to something much more dangerous. Lila's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What's on that land? Quinn's eyes darkened as he turned to face her. Something that could change everything, and not in a good way. She swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Was she ready for this? Could she survive whatever truth lay ahead? Elijah shifted in the chair, his eyes blinking with pain but sharp with determination. What's going on, Quinn? I know you're not just some passerby, and I know you're not doing this for free. Quinn didn't answer immediately. He took a long breath, his fingers tapping against the wood of the table before he finally spoke. I was hired to keep an eye on things. But the more I saw, the more I realized this isn't about land. It's about something much more powerful. You don't sell a ranch like that without consequences. Someone wanted you to come here, Lila, and someone wants to make sure you never leave. The truth hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about her family's legacy. It was about a force, a person, a shadow that was controlling everything, and it was closing in on them. Who's behind this? Elijah asked, his voice hoarse. Who's pulling the strings? Quinn's gaze flickered to the door. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched as he lowered his voice. You're not ready to know, but you will be soon. Lila's thoughts were spinning. She had come here to find peace, to sell the ranch, and to move on. But now she was tangled in a mystery that threatened to consume everything, her home, her family's name, and possibly her life. Just then, the sound of hooves echoed through night, and Lila's blood ran cold. The figure on horseback was no stranger. The man who had been following them was back, and this time he wasn't alone. The hooves grew louder, cutting through the silence of the night like a drumbeat. Lila's heart skipped, and she instinctively stepped closer to Elijah, her fingers curling tightly around the letter. The familiar, haunting thud of the approaching rider reverberated in her chest. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Quinn had gone still, his eyes narrowing, every muscle tense. He was listening, waiting, calculating. His hand hovered near the rifle on the wall, but he didn't reach for it. Yet, Lila's gaze flicked to the window, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick clouds. The shadow of the rider loomed in the distance, tall and deliberate. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just any rider. It was the same one who had been haunting her steps since the moment she arrived at the ranch. The man who had been following her, without her knowing. The man who had been watching them from the shadows. His intentions still unclear. Lila's voice trembled, but she couldn't hide the urgency in her words. Who is it, Quinn? Who's coming? Quinn stepped to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon with sharpness that sent a shiver down her spine. It's him, he muttered, his tone low but steady. The one I warned you about. The one who doesn't want you to leave here. Before Lila could speak, the sound of hooves stopped. A heavy silence blanketed the cabin. The distant rider had dismounted. The air felt charged, thick with something she couldn't yet name. Fear, perhaps, or something darker. The door creaked open without warning, cutting through the tension like a knife. A tall figure stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the porch. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Lila recognized the shadowy outline of his frame instantly. He was the man who had been trailing them. Evening, folks. The voice that followed was calm, unsettlingly calm, like the sound of a rattlesnake before it strikes. Deep, gravelly, and cold as the midnight air. Got a bit of business with you. Lila's pulse quickened. She took a step back, almost instinctively, but Elijah's hand gripped her wrist tightly, his strength grounding her. Quinn stepped forward, standing between them and the stranger. His hand tightened around the rifle, but he didn't raise it. Yet. Who are you? Quinn demanded, his voice hard and unforgiving. And what do you want? The man in the doorway chuckled darkly, his breath visible in the cool night air. I'm just a messenger, mister, but I'd reckon you won't be seeing many more sunsets if you don't listen to me. Lila's heart raced. The last few weeks had been a blur of confusion and tension, but now, standing in the face of this cold, ominous figure, everything was starting to make a terrifying sense. She couldn't help but glance at Quinn, searching for some sign of recognition, some hint of who this man was. But Quinn's face remained unreadable. The stranger's gaze shifted to Lila, his eyes cold and calculating beneath the shadow of his hat. "You're the one they want," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made her shiver. The land, the letter, it's all connected. A surge of panic gripped her, and before she could speak, the man continued, his words slow and deliberate. "You see, there's more at stake here than just the land, more than just your little ranch. There are powers at work, powers that would do anything to get their hands on what's hidden beneath that soil." Quinn's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What do you know about the land?" he growled. "And what do you want with her?" The stranger laughed again, a hollow, eerie sound that seemed to echo through the cabin. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," he said cryptically, his eyes glinting with something dark, something dangerous. "But I'd say you should all start worrying. Tomorrow will be too late." Before anyone could respond, he turned, disappearing into night like a shadow in the wind. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving the cabin eerily silent. The moment he was gone, Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her heart pounding in her chest. Quinn stood motionless, his gaze trained on the darkened doorway. "We're not safe here," he said after a long pause, his voice low and serious. Lila swallowed hard. "Who is he? What does he want?" Quinn's eyes flicked to her, then to Elijah. "I'll tell you everything soon. But right now we need to move. They know about the letter. They know about the land. And they won't stop until they get it." Lila's stomach twisted in dread. It was too much to process. Too many questions, too many unknowns. And the weight of everything, her family's legacy, the land, the strangers who wanted it, was crushing her under its weight. "Where do we go?" Elijah asked, his voice shaky but determined. Quinn didn't hesitate. "We get out of here. Now." As they hurried out of the cabin, the sound of hooves returned, this time louder and more frantic. But they weren't alone this time. Several riders appeared on horseback, closing in fast. Quinn's face turned grim as he recognized them. "We've been followed," he muttered, his hand going to the rifle. "And there's no running from this." The hooves grew louder, echoing through the night as the riders closed in. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and panicked. The silence had been broken, replaced now by the sound of danger drawing nearer. She could hear them, voices rising above the wind, the creak of saddles, the steady thud of hooves on the earth. "Quinn," Lila whispered, her voice shaky. "Who are they?" Quinn didn't answer immediately. His eyes were focused ahead, scanning the horizon as he motioned for them to move quickly. Elijah, ever the silent protector, pulled Lila toward the cover of the trees, his body taut with readiness. Quinn followed, his hand still on his rifle, his jaw clenched with determination. "They're coming for us," Quinn muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "They don't want to land. They want everything else that comes with it. Power, control, they want her." Lila could feel the weight of his words. The land was no longer just a piece of earth. It was a symbol, something more significant than she had realized. The truth was becoming clearer by the second, but it also felt more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. The riders broke through the tree line, their figures outlined by the moonlight. There were 5 of them, all wearing wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces, their dark silhouettes menacing against the dim light. Their horses moved like shadows, effortlessly closing the distance between them and the group. Lila's pulse quickened as one of the riders broke away from the rest and rode up to the front. He was taller than the others, his build strong and commanding, his face hidden beneath a thick beard. His eyes, though, were cold and calculating as they locked onto her. "Stay behind me," Quinn said sharply, his voice a low growl. He stood firm, his rifle at the ready. Elijah instinctively positioned himself between Lila and the approaching riders, his face hard with determination, his hand on the knife at his belt. The leader of the riders stopped just a few feet away, his horse snorting in the cold night air. He looked down at them with an unsettling calmness, his gaze shifting between Lila and Quinn. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice gravelly, like the land itself had worn him down. "The land doesn't belong to you, lady, and neither does your life." Lila's heart skipped in her chest. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there, too, something personal. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not afraid of you," Lila said, lifting her chin, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "If you think I'm going to let you take me, or this land, you're wrong." The rider's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't get it, do you?" He nodded toward the other riders, who now flanked him on either side. "You're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. You can't stop it. You can't fight it. You'll just end up like the others, dead." A chill ran through Lila's spine. The other riders shifted in their saddles, eyes scanning the group. There was a tension in the air, the kind that felt like a moment about to break, to shatter. Quinn spoke, his voice low and filled with authority. "You'd better leave now. You don't know who you're dealing with." The leader of the riders didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of paper, which he held out toward Lila. "This is for you. Take it, and think long and hard about your next move." Lila's hand hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the best of her. She stepped forward and took the paper from the rider, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the note quickly, her heart pounding as the words slowly sank in. "You have 1 week. If you don't hand over what we want by then, the consequences will be dire. No one will be safe. Not you, not your friends. Not even your precious land." Lila's breath caught in her throat. The note was a threat, a warning, and it was clear that the land was only the beginning. The rider's smirk deepened as he saw her reaction. "You've got a week to decide," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "After that, it'll be too late." Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back toward the others. The riders followed, disappearing into night, like shadows retreating before the dawn. Quinn didn't relax his stance until they were out of sight, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. He turned to Lila, his expression grave, his eyes hard with resolve. "They're not playing around," Quinn said, his voice cold. "And now neither can we." Lila stood there, the note crumpled tightly in her hand, her mind racing. The rider's words echoed in her head. 1 week. 1 week to make a decision that could change everything. As they made their way back to the cabin, the tension between them was palpable. Lila's thoughts were a whirlwind, her emotions a mix of fear, anger, and determination. But one thing was clear. She couldn't do this alone. Just as they reached the cabin, a distant sound caught their attention, a soft rustling in the bushes nearby. Quinn's hand went instinctively to his rifle again, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Lila's breath hitched. "Who's there?" A figure stepped out of the shadows, slowly approaching. A familiar figure, someone she hadn't seen in years. Someone who could either be their salvation or their doom. "Lila," the figure said, his voice soft but urgent. "We need to talk, and we need to do it now." Lila's heart skipped a beat as the figure emerged from the shadows. The man who stood before them was tall, broad-shouldered, with a ruggedness to his face that spoke of hard days and sun. His beard, a mix of gray and dark brown, framed a pair of eyes that had seen things that Lila couldn't quite place, but felt a deep sense of familiarity with. Quinn immediately stepped in front of Lila, his hand still gripping the rifle. His stance was defensive, eyes narrowed, but there was something in the way he studied the man that suggested this wasn't the first time they had crossed paths. "Who the hell are you?" Quinn's voice was low, like the growl of a wolf warning another to stay back. The man's face didn't shift, even under the weight of Quinn's suspicion. He stood there for a moment, his eyes flicking to Lila and then back to Quinn. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice rough with a lifetime of dust and regret. "But I'm here to help." Lila's stomach churned. "Help?" she repeated, still on edge. "Why should we trust you?" The man took a step forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. His gaze softened as he looked at Lila, his voice dropping in volume, as if he understood the depth of her distrust. "Because I'm the one who sent the letter," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. Lila froze, her breath caught in her throat. The letter. The same threat. The same ultimatum that had been handed to her just hours earlier. The one she had been afraid to open, fearing the consequences. The one that promised dire consequences if she didn't comply. You're the one who... Her voice trailed off, but she couldn't finish the sentence. She had been so certain that the riders would be the end of her, she hadn't considered that someone else was pulling the strings. Quinn's hand tightened on his rifle, his knuckles white. "What do you want with her?" he asked, his tone a mix of suspicion and anger. The man looked down at the ground for a brief moment. His expression conflicted. "It's not her I want. It's the land," he said, his voice quiet. "And I'm willing to help you keep it. If you'll listen." Lila stepped forward, her resolve solidifying as the weight of his words settled in. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice hard with the edge of determination. The man hesitated. "I've got some information," he said, his voice low. "The riders, those men you saw earlier, they're not just after your land. They're part of something bigger, something much darker." Quinn raised an eyebrow. "Bigger? Darker?" he repeated, clearly skeptical. "They've got people all over this valley, people who've been in control for longer than you think," the man continued, his gaze moving between Lila and Quinn. "And they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Lila felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her hand shook, but she didn't let it show. "Why should I trust you?" she asked again, her voice steady. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered piece of parchment. He handed it to Lila without a word, his eyes watching her closely. "Because I'm the one who's been trying to protect you," he said, the weight of his words lingering in the silence. Lila opened the parchment with trembling fingers. The writing was barely legible, faded with age, but the words were clear. "The land belongs to you by right. But it's not just the land they're after. They want control, and there's only one way to stop them. You'll need to find the key. The key that will unlock what they want most." The message made her stomach turn. The key? What did that mean? The land had already been enough of a burden. Now it seemed like it was tied to something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. "What's this?" Lila whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The man's expression darkened. "It's what you need to find in order to survive. And if you want to keep your land and your life, you'll have to act fast." Quinn's hand dropped from his rifle, though he didn't seem any less on edge. "What are we supposed to do with this?" he asked. The man looked back at him, then at Lila. "You'll need to search. You'll need to look beyond the land and see what's hidden in plain sight." Lila's head swam with questions, each one more confusing than the last. "Hidden where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everywhere," the man replied simply. "You've already got the key. Now, you just need to figure out how to use it." A heavy silence fell over the group. The man's words weighed on Lila, pressing down like 100-pound stone on her chest. What did he mean? What key was he talking about? And why did it feel like she was being pulled into something much bigger than herself? Suddenly, the distant sound of hooves interrupted her thoughts. A single rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the moonlight. The man's gaze shifted to the approaching rider, and his expression grew grim. "They're coming," he said, his voice urgent. "And they won't stop until they have what they want." Lila's heart raced. The rider was getting closer, and with him, the danger was closing in. Quinn stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Lila, his rifle in hand. The man who had warned them stepped back into the shadows. "You have to be ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is just the beginning." The rider on the horizon drew closer. It was only a matter of time before the next chapter in this deadly game began. The rider stopped just short of their camp, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the rising moon. As he dismounted, the weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. And then, from the darkness, another voice called out, one that made Lila's blood run cold. "I told you, you're not leaving this valley alive." The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Lila's breath caught in her throat as a rider, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steely gaze, stepped forward. His boots hit the dirt with heavy precision, his movements deliberate and calculated. There was no doubt in Lila's mind that this man was no stranger to violence. Quinn's hand was still on his rifle, his knuckles white, ready to react at the slightest threat. But Lila could see the hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty about who this man was, and why he just issued a threat so chilling. The rider paused, his eyes flicking over the three of them with a look that suggested he had already assessed their weaknesses. Lila felt a cold sweat form on her back, a feeling of dread that gripped her heart. Then the man spoke again, his voice low but dripping with menace. "I told you, you're not leaving this valley alive." Quinn's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he subtly shifted his weight, positioning himself between Lila and the rider. His body language said everything. "I will protect her." Lila's heart raced, and for a moment, she felt an intense, irrational sense of safety. She didn't know this man, but in that moment, he seemed like her only chance. Lila glanced at the man who had warned them, the one who had delivered the letter. His face was unreadable, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a worn-out revolver. He said nothing, but his presence had shifted. He was no longer the stranger offering help. He was now part of the battle. "Who are you?" Lila finally found her voice, trying to force herself to stand tall, despite the sinking feeling in her chest. "What do you want with us?" The rider's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know what I want, lady. It's the land. And anyone who stands in my way is as good as dead." Lila felt the world around her closing in. The land. It always came back to that cursed piece of earth. Her late husband's dream. His blood, sweat, and tears. That was all that mattered to men like this. To them, it wasn't about people. It was about ownership and power. Lila shook her head, refusing to be intimidated. "You won't get it. You won't take anything from me." The rider laughed, a dry, humorless sound that made Lila's skin crawl. "You don't have much of a choice. You're just one woman. What can you possibly do to stop me?" He glanced at Quinn. "And him? A rancher? He's just another fool in a town full of fools." Quinn stepped forward then, his voice quiet but full of a dangerous calm. "You might be right, but this fool's going to make sure you regret underestimating us." The rider's eyes narrowed, studying Quinn for a moment before he turned his attention back to Lila. "You don't know what you're dealing with. There's no way out of this valley, no way out of this mess." Lila felt the weight of his words, but she refused to let them break her resolve. Her life had been full of hardship, but she had never backed down. Not from a fight, not from the land she loved, and certainly not from the men who thought they could control it. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice firm. "And you're not taking anything." The rider's face hardened, and for a split second, Lila could see the flicker of rage in his eyes. But then, as quickly as it came, it vanished, replaced by the same cold calculation. He glanced at the man who had been silent, watching from the shadows. "Is this the one who's been helping you?" the rider asked, his voice dripping with disdain. The man who had warned them stepped forward, his hand resting on the revolver. "I've been trying to keep her safe," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't think you're going to walk away from this without a fight." The rider looked at him for a long moment, sizing him up. Then he nodded slowly, almost as if he had made a decision. "We'll see about that," he said. "This valley's mine, and I don't take kindly to trespassers." Lila could feel the tension thickening in the air. She knew this was it, the moment when everything would either come to a head or fall apart. There was no more room for fear, no more room for hesitation. She looked at Quinn, who met her gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. There was something in his eyes, something protective, something fierce. In that moment, she realized she wasn't alone. They would face whatever came next together. The rider shifted, his hand moving toward the gun holstered at his side. Quinn's hand was already on the trigger of his rifle, muscles tense, ready to react. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the distant sound of more hooves echoed through the night. At least 3 riders, coming fast. More of them. More trouble. Lila's heart pounded as she looked back at the rider in front of them, wondering how much worse it could get. "Looks like your reinforcements are here," Quinn said, his voice cold but tinged with a hint of amusement. "But you won't find what you're looking for." The rider's eyes flicked to the horizon, then back to Lila and Quinn. He seemed to calculate the new threat before him. and for a brief moment, uncertainty flashed across his face. But then, just as quickly, he squared his shoulders. "I'll be back," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "And next time, you won't be so lucky." Without another word, the rider mounted his horse and rode off into the night, his men following close behind. Lila exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had survived. Quinn turned to her, his face hard but not unkind. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice low and steady. "But we need to get ready. This fight isn't over yet." Lila nodded, her body still shaking from the adrenaline. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. The battle for her land, her future, was far from over. As the sound of the approaching riders faded into the night, Lila stood there, staring into the darkness, wondering if the promise Quinn had made would hold true. Would they be ready when the storm returned? Or would they be caught in the crossfire of a battle they could not win? The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of danger, as the first stars began to twinkle above them, and in the shadows, hidden from their view, a new figure watched from the distance. The night was thick with tension, the kind that settled over the land like a heavy fog. Lila's heart thudded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of Quinn's words pressing down on her. They had survived for now, but they both knew the storm was coming. This was just a calm before it broke. Quinn's eyes scanned the horizon one last time, his face impassive, but Lila saw the wariness in his movements. He didn't trust the night to stay quiet for long, and neither did she. "Get inside," he said, his voice low. "I'll keep watch for a bit." Lila hesitated, her hand resting on the doorframe. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask him if they were really safe, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was asking for reassurance for herself or for him. The threat still hung in the air, just beyond reach, like the first crack of thunder before the storm unleashed its fury. She nodded, stepping inside the cabin. The warm glow of the hearth flickered as the door shut behind her, and she felt the sudden silence settle over her like a blanket. It wasn't peaceful silence, though. It was the kind of quiet that made you wait for the next sound to break it. The kind of quiet that made you hold your breath. Quinn stood in the doorway for a moment longer, his profile outlined against the fading light. He wasn't one to show much emotion, but Lila could see the tension in his posture, the tight set of his shoulders as he kept watch. The hours stretched out. The warmth from the fire didn't seem to reach Lila's bones, and the longer she sat there, the more she could feel the weight of what had happened, and what was still to come. The land she'd fought for, the life she'd built with her husband, all of it was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. Lila thought of the rider, the man who had warned them, and the man who had threatened her. They wanted her land, and it was clear that nothing would stop them from taking it, no matter what they had to do to get it. Her mind drifted back to the letter, the one she had never truly understood until tonight. Was it a sign? A warning? Had her late husband known what was coming? And why had he left her to fight this battle alone? She ran her fingers over the edges of the worn parchment, the ink smudged in places, the words fading in some areas. She knew she had to make a choice soon, and it couldn't be just for her. It had to be for the future of her family, for her children, for this land that had been in her family for generations. Meanwhile, outside, Quinn's watch was growing more intense. The breeze had picked up, rustling the dry leaves along the ground, whispering through the trees. His hand instinctively gripped the rifle at his side as he scanned the open land in front of him. He was used to waiting for danger, used to the long hours of silence before the storm broke. But this time, something felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Then a sound, a soft rustle, the crack of a twig. Quinn's muscles tensed. Someone was out there. Lila was still inside, lost in her thoughts, when she heard it too, a faint thudding sound like hooves on the dirt. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood, her instincts kicking in. She moved toward the door, but before she could reach it, Quinn's voice stopped her. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's them. The riders." Lila's breath hitched. Her mind raced. She hadn't expected them to come so soon, but the reality of the situation hit her like a punch in the gut. They were coming for her. Quinn, she started, but he was already moving, stepping outside into the night, rifle in hand. Lila hesitated, torn between the urge to stay and the need to help. She wanted to be there with him, to fight alongside him, but she knew she couldn't. Not this time. She wasn't prepared for what was coming. She wasn't prepared for the kind of battle that would determine everything. The riders came into view just as Quinn positioned himself behind a large rock, his rifle trained on them. The leader of the group, a tall, dark-haired man with a scar running down the side of his face, led the charge. Behind him, the others were spread out, moving with quiet precision. Lila watched from the window, her pulse racing as Quinn's figure disappeared behind the rock. She couldn't see him anymore, but she knew he was waiting for the right moment. Stay down. Quinn's voice came through the crack in the door, low and commanding. Don't move until I tell you. Lila nodded, her throat tight, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she was depending on him until now, how much she needed him to be the protector, the one who could face the danger without hesitation. But what if he couldn't stop them? The leader of the riders dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He motioned for the others to stay back as he approached the cabin, his eyes scanning the area. Lila's breath caught in her throat as he walked toward the door, his gaze locking on her window. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, the sound of a shot rang out. Quinn's rifle had fired, but the leader wasn't down. The rider's hand flew to his chest, but he didn't fall. Instead, he took another step, his eyes narrowing with fury. You've made a mistake, he called, his voice echoing in the night. You've sealed your fate. Quinn's voice followed, a low growl. No, this ends now. Lila's stomach turned. She couldn't stand by any longer. She needed to act. The choice had been made for her long ago. This was her fight, too. She reached for her rifle, her fingers shaking as she pulled it from the rack. She had to help. She had to protect her home. As the confrontation escalated, Lila stepped out into the night, rifle in hand, ready to fight. The tension was thick in the air, the sound of hooves approaching fast. But just as the first shot rang out again, something caught her eye, something moving in the distance, hidden in the trees. Was it another rider? Or someone else coming to make a difference? The mystery of who stood behind the riders loomed, and Lila's pulse quickened as the winds of fate began to turn, drawing her deeper into the battle she had never asked for, but now would never be able to escape. The air was thick with tension. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed to the still night, but it didn't end in the way anyone expected. Lila's heart raced in her chest as she stepped into the open, rifle gripped tightly in her hands. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish. The riders were right there, their presence overwhelming. But there was something else, a feeling that this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about survival, and survival meant everything. She took her position behind the cabin's wall, trying to steady her breath. Her pulse was a steady drumbeat in her ears, the weight of the gun seeming to grow heavier with every passing second. The wind stirred the dry grass around her feet, but the only thing she could focus on was the dark shape standing in the distance. Quinn's voice came through the darkness, low and urgent. Lila, stay hidden. But it was too late for that. She had already committed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Who was the figure lurking in the shadows? Another enemy? Or someone? Who could help? She couldn't risk assuming. She had to act. The leader of the riders was closer now, and Lila could see the anger burning in his eyes as he pulled his revolver from its holster. The way his lips curled in a sneer made her stomach twist. The danger was palpable, and she could feel it in every fiber of her being. You've made a mistake, the rider called again, his voice like gravel. This ranch is as good as ours. Lila's hand tightened around the rifle, her fingers shaking with anger. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was a part of her family's history, and she wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. But then, in the distance, a movement caught her eye again. The figure was closer now, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. Lila's heart skipped a beat. There was something familiar about the way they moved, something she couldn't place. Could be a friend or another threat. She shifted her weight, raising the rifle, her eyes locked on the figure. She needed to know who it was before she made a decision. Just as she was about to call out, a shot rang out from behind her. The sharp crack of the rifle. Quinn had fired, and Lila spun, fear flashing across her face. She had almost forgotten about him. But the shot wasn't aimed at the leader. It was a warning shot. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Quinn and Lila. "You're going to regret this," he growled, his fingers twitching on the trigger. But before he could make another move, the figure in the shadows finally revealed themselves. Stepping out from behind a large tree, the figure raised her arms in a gesture of peace. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Hold your fire." It was Cassidy, the young man Quinn had once called a friend, the one who had disappeared without a trace months ago. But here he was, standing in front of them, unharmed. His clothes were weathered, his face dirted, but his eyes were clear and focused. Lila felt a wave of relief wash over her. Cassidy was here. He wasn't one of the riders, but her relief was short-lived. Cassidy's eyes shifted toward the leader of the riders, and something in his gaze told her that this was more than just an old acquaintance showing up. "Cassidy, what are you doing here?" Quinn called, his voice laced with confusion. Cassidy's face was unreadable, his expression hard as he looked back at Quinn. "I'm here because I'm not sure who I can trust anymore, but it looks like you need help." The rider seemed to pause at Cassidy's words, but the tension didn't ease. The leader of the group let out a low chuckle. "You think this is a game?" The leader spat, aiming his gun at Cassidy. "Get out of the way, boy. This land is ours now." Quinn stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and Lila. "Not today," he said, his voice cold and steady. But before anyone could react, Cassidy stepped forward, hand raised. "Wait!" Lila's eyes narrowed. Was Cassidy going to help them, or had he turned on them too? "Let's not do this," Cassidy said, his voice suddenly calm. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to make a deal. A deal you won't regret." The leader of the riders scoffed, his gun still pointed at Cassidy. "And why would we trust you? You've been gone too long, boy." Cassidy took a step closer. "Because I know things," he said, locking eyes with the leader. "Things that you don't want to know. Things about who's really behind this. And if you don't listen, things could get a whole lot worse." Lila's heart skipped a beat. What was Cassidy talking about? Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses interrupted the standoff. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, and the riders froze. Lila's pulse quickened. She couldn't tell what was coming, but she knew one thing. The situation was about to get even more complicated. And just like that, the standoff shifted. Cassidy had introduced a new element, and Lila had no idea where the story was going to lead. All she knew was that the battle for the ranch wasn't over yet. But the question was, who were these new riders? Were they friend or foe? As the galloping horses came closer, the leader of the riders glanced nervously toward the horizon. Cassidy's face tightened, his expression unreadable. Lila could feel the air growing heavier with anticipation. Who was riding in? Would they save them or doom them all? The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally breaking. And as the riders approached, it was clear no one was leaving this land without paying a price. The sound of hooves grew louder, vibrating through the earth beneath their feet. The riders were nearing, their presence unmistakable, and tension crackled in the air like a summer storm. The leader of the bandits took a step back, his gun hand twitching nervously. His men exchanged wary glances, unsure whether they should stand their ground or make a quick retreat. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. The dust hung thick in the air, almost suffocating her as she strained to see the approaching figures. Cassidy's voice was low but urgent. "Stay calm, Lila," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. This could go either way. Quinn stood at Lila's side, his posture tense, eyes flicking between the riders in front of them and the approaching group. Lila could feel the pull of his presence, the calm steadiness of him. But even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his movements. The horses appeared, their riders silhouetted against the fading sunlight, casting long shadows across the dirt path. As they drew closer, Lila saw the glint of steel and the flash of badges. Sheriffs. But there was something off about them. These weren't the lawmen they were used to. The leader of the riders, still holding his revolver tight in his grip, eyed them warily. "Who are you?" he growled, his voice sharp, demanding answers. "You better be here for the right reasons." The sheriff in the front raised a hand, signaling for his men to halt. His weathered face was hard, the sun and years of hard work etched deep into his skin. "We're here for the land, not to fight," he said, his voice gruff and commanding. "But we need to talk." Lila watched the interaction, her stomach in knots. Were they here to help? Or were they just another complication? She couldn't tell, but the energy around them shifted, the air thick with uncertainty. Cassidy stepped forward, his posture rigid. "And what do you want with this land?" His voice was steady but filled with an edge of suspicion. The sheriff locked eyes with Cassidy, a flicker of recognition passing between them before he spoke. The land's owner had some connections, some debts that need paying. "But it looks like we're going to have a problem here." He motioned to the leader of the bandits, who still stood with his gun drawn. Quinn's jaw tightened, and he stepped in front of Lila, positioning himself as a shield. "You better not think about taking one more step, Sheriff. We're not handing this place over without a fight." Lila felt the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Was this the end of the struggle? Would she have to choose between siding with the sheriff and his men, or the people who had already shown themselves as nothing but trouble? But Cassidy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The land's not for sale," he said firmly, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "And you do well to turn around while you still have the chance." The sheriff hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The men behind him exchanged glances, their nerves palpable. The leader of the bandits seemed to sense it too, his grip on his revolver tightening, his stance shifting as if preparing for a fight. "What's your play, Cassidy?" the sheriff asked, his eyes narrowing. Cassidy stood taller, his gaze never wavering. "My play is that this land doesn't belong to any of you," he said quietly. "And the only thing that will come from trying to take it is blood." The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of dust and earth as the standoff lingered, neither side willing to make the first move. Lila's pulse thudded in her ears, and she felt the tension between Cassidy, the sheriff, and the bandits thickening with every passing second. The stakes were rising, and every move mattered. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed behind them. The new riders had arrived. Lila whipped around, her heart pounding. From the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar figure, a man she hadn't expected. Lucas McCade, the man who had been with her father before he passed away, the man who had sworn to protect her, even after he disappeared from her life years ago. He was riding in now, his dark eyes sharp, his features hard under the brim of his wide hat. "Cassidy," Lucas said in his low, gravelly voice as he approached, "I see you've been busy." Cassidy's eyes hardened as he looked at Lucas. "You got some nerve showing up here." Lucas didn't flinch. "I know, but I'm here for the same reason as you. The land." Lila's stomach churned. She wasn't sure where Lucas stood. Was he part of the lawmen, or did he have his own agenda? "We're not selling," she said, her voice steady but firm. Lucas shot her a glance, his lips twitching with something like a smirk. "I didn't say anything about selling," he replied, his tone dark with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. The sound of hooves grew louder, vibrating through the earth beneath their feet. The riders were nearing, their presence unmistakable, and tension crackled in the air like a summer storm. The leader of the bandits took a step back, his gun hand twitching nervously. His men exchanged wary glances, unsure whether they should stand their ground or make a quick retreat. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. The dust hung thick in the air, almost suffocating her as she strained to see the approaching figures. Cassidy's voice was low but urgent. "Stay calm, Lila," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. This could go either way. Quinn stood at Lila's side, his posture tense, eyes flicking between the riders in front of them and the approaching group. Lila could feel the pull of his presence, the calm steadiness of him. But even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his movements. The horses appeared, their riders silhouetted against the fading sunlight, casting long shadows across the dirt path. As they drew closer, Lila saw the glint of steel and the flash of badges. Sheriffs, but there was something off about them. These weren't the lawmen they were used to. The leader of the riders, still holding his revolver tight in his grip, eyed them warily. "Who are you?" he growled, his voice sharp, demanding answers. "You better be here for the right reasons." The sheriff in the front raised a hand, signaling for his men to halt. His weathered face was hard, the sun and years of hard work etched deep into his skin. "We're here for the land, not the fight," he said, his voice gruff and commanding. "But we need to talk." Lila watched the interaction, her stomach in knots. Were they here to help? Or were they just another complication? She couldn't tell, but the energy around them shifted, the air thick with uncertainty. Cassidy stepped forward, his posture rigid. "And what do you want with this land?" His voice was steady but filled with an edge of suspicion. The sheriff locked eyes with Cassidy, a flicker of recognition passing between them before he spoke. The land's owner had some connections, some debts that need paying. "But it looks like we're going to have a problem here." He motioned to the leader of the bandits, who still stood with his gun drawn. Quinn's jaw tightened, and he stepped in front of Lila, positioning himself as a shield. "You better not think about taking one more step, Sheriff. We're not handing this place over without a fight." Lila felt the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Was this the end of the struggle? Would she have to choose between siding with the sheriff and his men, or the people who had already shown themselves as nothing but trouble? But Cassidy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The land's not for sale," he said firmly, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "And you do well to turn around while you still have the chance." The sheriff hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The men behind him exchanged glances, their nerves palpable. The leader of the bandit seemed to sense it too, his grip on his revolver tightening, his stance shifting as if preparing for a fight. "What's your play, Cassidy?" the sheriff asked, his eyes narrowing. Cassidy stood taller, his gaze never wavering. "My play is that this land doesn't belong to any of you," he said quietly. "And the only thing that will come from trying to take it is blood." The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of dust and earth as the standoff lingered, neither side willing to make the first move. Lila's pulse thudded in her ears, and she felt the tension between Cassidy, the sheriff, and the bandits thickening with every passing second. The stakes were rising, and every move mattered. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed behind them. The new riders had arrived. Lila whipped around, her heart pounding. From the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar figure, a man she hadn't expected. Lucas McCade, the man who had been with her father before he passed away, the man who had sworn to protect her, even after he disappeared from her life years ago. He was riding in now, his dark eyes sharp, his features hard under the brim of his wide hat. "Cassidy," Lucas said in his low, gravelly voice as he approached, "I see you've been busy." Cassidy's eyes hardened as he looked at Lucas. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Lucas didn't flinch. "I know, but I'm here for the same reason as you. The land." Lila's stomach churned. She wasn't sure where Lucas stood. Was he part of the lawmen, or did he have his own agenda? "We're not selling," she said, her voice steady but firm. Lucas shot her a glance, his lips twitching with something like a smirk. "I didn't say anything about selling," he replied, his tone dark with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. The seconds felt like hours as Lila stood in the midst of the standoff. The rising tension seemed to crackle in the air, each heartbeat louder than the next. She didn't know whether to trust Lucas or fear him. His sudden appearance had thrown everything into chaos. Cassidy's jaw was set with determination, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes as he eyed the newcomer. "Lucas, what are you doing here?" Cassidy's voice was sharp, the familiar tone of a man who had history with Lucas, and the undercurrent of distrust was unmistakable. Lucas met Cassidy's gaze with an unreadable expression, his hand resting just above the revolver holstered at his hip. "I'm here to settle something," he said, his voice low and steady, like he was trying to keep something buried just beneath the surface. "The land, it's not just yours to protect, Cassidy." Lila's heart thudded in her chest as she watched him. This was the man her father had trusted, the man who had vanished and left her alone. She couldn't decide if the anger or confusion that bubbled up was stronger. "You've been gone too long, Lucas," Cassidy said, shaking his head. "Now you show up, and suddenly you want it on this?" The sheriff, still on his horse, shifted uneasily, glancing back and forth between the two men. He hadn't said a word since Lucas arrived, but the silence had become louder with each passing moment. "Maybe it's time we hear what this man has to say," he muttered, voice rough as the gravel beneath his boots. Lucas raised a hand, still on the reins of his horse, and in that moment, everything fell still, his eyes locked with Lila's, a flicker of recognition in them. And for just a heartbeat, everything in the world seemed to stop. The rest of the world seemed miles away, as if the wind held its breath, waiting for him to speak. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Lila," Lucas said quietly, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm here to stop a war from starting over this land. Your father knew it would come to this. He knew someone would come for it." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she whispered, not sure whether she wanted to hear the answer or not. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if the truth was a heavy burden he wasn't sure how to carry. "Your father had dealings with men in this town, people who had interests here. Those interests didn't end when he passed away. They've been waiting." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the bandits who were still lingering, sensing the shift in the air. Their hands twitched toward their weapons, the tension in the air palpable. Lila didn't know whether they were trying to feel out the situation or preparing for a fight. "Your father was part of something bigger than you realize," Lucas continued, his voice hardening with the weight of his words. "These men," he nodded toward the sheriff and his deputies, "and those who followed him are only part of a larger problem." Suddenly, one of the bandits, the leader, shifted his weight on his feet. His hand hovered near his holstered gun, but there was no sign of him pulling it yet. He spoke, his voice rough. "Enough talk, Lucas. You say you're here to protect the land, but you've been just as involved as anyone else in the mess we're in. What's to stop us from taking what's ours?" Cassidy's hand twitched toward his gun. Lila's stomach dropped. The promise of violence hung thick in the air. Lucas took a slow step forward, moving with a calm that made her breath catch. He raised his voice, his words strong and clear. "You have no right to this land. This isn't yours to take. It's never been yours." Cassidy turned to Lila, his voice lowered, raw with emotion. "Lila, this isn't just about the land anymore. It's about what's right. We've been protecting this place, your father's legacy, for too long. We won't let it fall into the wrong hands." Lila could see the intensity in Cassidy's eyes, the weight of the years he had spent protecting her and the ranch. But she also felt something else, doubt. Could she trust Lucas now? Was he really here to help? Or was there something he wasn't telling her? As she opened her mouth to respond, the wind picked up, kicking up dust, swirling around them. In that moment, she knew the choice was hers. And no matter what she decided, the consequences would be more far-reaching than anything she could have imagined. Just as the tension reached its peak, the distant sound of thunder rumbled across the valley. Was it a storm on the horizon, or was it the rumble of more riders coming in to settle their debts? The decision would come soon, but would Lila's choice be the one that changed everything? The sound of the distant gunshot cut through the tension like a blade, sending ripples of fear through the group. The riders on the horizon hadn't moved yet, but their expressions were hard to read. Was it a signal to advance, or a sign to retreat? Lila felt the air grow thick with anticipation as she glanced at Lucas. His hand was steady on the grip of his revolver, his gaze fixed on the incoming riders. The way he stood, solid and calm, belied the storm brewing inside him. It was clear he was prepared for whatever came next. Cassidy was less composed. His jaw tightened, fists clenched at his sides as his eyes flicked between Lila and the bandits. He knew what this was. This was no longer conversation. This was about survival, about holding on to everything that had been built, and fighting for the future. Lila, still frozen in place, could feel the weight of their gazes. Lucas, always a pragmatic one, who believed in power and control. Cassidy, always loyal, always protective, who believed in justice and righteousness. And here she stood, caught between them, tore between what was right, what was safe, and what was hers to choose. The wind howled again, and as the riders drew closer, Lila's heart skipped a beat. They were coming. But what did they want? Were they here to claim the land, or had they come for something more? Something much more personal? Lila, get behind me. Cassidy's voice was low, urgent. His protective instincts kicked in as he moved to shield her from whatever came next. No, she said firmly, stepping forward. I'm not hiding, Cassidy. Not this time. This is my fight, too. The bandits were just a few hundred yards away now. Lila could make out their faces, hard, lined with the sun, and eyes gleaming with the greed and hunger of men who had nothing left to lose. They were led by a tall, scarred man with a reputation that had followed him like a shadow through the frontier. Tommy rush-eyed Tanner. Looks like the lady's got some fire in her. Tanner called out, his voice carrying over the wind. He spurred his horse forward, the rest of the riders following close behind. Lila's heart pounded as she met his gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes locked on his. Tommy Tanner, she called out, her voice strong, despite the fear clawing at her chest. What do you want? Tanner smiled, a cruel, cold smile that made her skin crawl. What I want what's owed to me. This land you're sitting on, sweetheart, it ain't yours to keep. It's mine or will be soon enough. Lila's chest tightened. There was no bargaining with a man like Tanner. No hope of convincing him otherwise. But there was something in her, something deep and ancient, that refused to back down. This was hers. It had always been hers. I won't let you take it, she said, her voice steady, though every part of her was shaking. Tanner's smile faded, replaced by a scowl. You don't have a choice. Before Lila could respond, Cassidy moved in front of her, stepping between her and the bandits. You want this land? You'll have to go through me first. Tanner's eyes narrowed. The tension was palpable, the air charged with the threat of violence. But there was more at play than just land. This was about something deeper, something Lila couldn't quite place, but could feel in the pit of her stomach. The riders were closing in, and the ground beneath them felt like it was shaking. The decision Lila had feared, the one she had put off for so long, was here. She could no longer stand in the shadows of her father's legacy, or in protection of Cassidy. This was her fight, her choice. I don't want bloodshed, Lila said, her voice rising. I don't want anyone to die over this land. Cassidy glanced at her, his expression softening, but his eyes remained fierce. Then let's make sure we don't have to fight, Lila. But it was too late. The riders were already drawing closer. The wind whipped around them, and Lila could almost feel the dust of the past swirling in the air. Every decision, every moment, had led her to this point. And then, just as the riders were within range, a shot rang out. Lila's heart stopped. The shot echoed across the land, sharp and deafening. Cassidy's face twisted in surprise, his hand flying to his side, blood seeping between his fingers. The question lingered in the air. Who fired the shot? Was it the bandits, or was it someone else? And as Lila rushed to Cassidy's side, the world seemed to stand still. The storm had broken, and the battle for her land, her life, was far from over. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in the air, ringing in Lila's ears like an unwanted omen. Cassidy stumbled backward, his hand clutching at the wound in his side, his face contorted with pain. The riders, now just a few feet away, paused as if unsure whether they had successfully struck the blow or if they had just ignited something much more dangerous. Lila's heart raced as she rushed to Cassidy's side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the flow of blood. His breathing was shallow, labored, but his eyes remained sharp. He wasn't unconscious yet, and for that, she was grateful. Stay with me, Cassidy, Lila whispered, her voice desperate as she tried to stem the bleeding with her hands. She could feel the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Cassidy's lips parted in a grimace. It's nothing, Lila. I've had worse. But the pallor of his face told another story. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she pressed harder against the wound. The riders were still circling them like vultures, their leader, Tommy Tanner, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Tommy's voice broke through the tension, smooth and mocking. I'd say you're in a bit of a bind, sweetheart. Your man's bleeding out, and you're still trying to protect this land. You can give up now, or I can make it easier on you. Lila's eyes flashed with fury as she looked up at him, her fear now a sharpened edge, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'll never give it up," she said, her voice a fierce whisper, filled with defiance. "Not to you, not to anyone." Tommy chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. This land's already mine. It's just a matter of time before you realize it." His men laughed behind him, the sound like gravel scraping on stone. But Lila didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Cassidy had taken a bullet for this land, and for her, that was more than a promise she could break. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a woman defending her land anymore. She was a woman who had lost everything and was ready to risk it all to make sure she didn't lose anything else. Before she could respond, a sharp voice called out from behind the bandits. "Enough!" Everyone froze. Lila's heart leaped in her chest, and she looked up, surprised to see Lucas standing on a nearby ridge, his silhouette framed by the fading daylight. His boots were planted firmly in the dirt, his hat tilted down, hiding his eyes, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance. The riders turned, their surprise evident. Tommy Tanner's smirk faltered for a moment before he regained control, turning to face Lucas. "What do you want, Matthews?" Tommy asked, his voice less sure now. Lucas took a step forward, his revolver gleaming in the last rays of the setting sun. "I've been watching you for too long, Tanner. I've seen enough." He let the words hang in the air, his gaze moving from Tommy to his men, sizing them up. "You're not taking this land," Lucas continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down Lila's spine. "And if you try, you'll regret it." Tommy's eyes narrowed, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. The tension in the air thickened as Lila's pulse quickened. "Not this time, Tanner," Lucas added. "Not while I'm here." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped chirping. The sound of the earth beneath their feet was all that remained. And then everything erupted. A shot rang out from the distance, the crack of the bullet splitting the silence. Lucas's arm jerked back, the force of the impact throwing him off balance. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she saw him stumble, his face paling as he reached for the wound in his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, his body swaying for a moment before he regained his footing. But the damage was done. The shot had come from somewhere unseen, and in that instant, Lucas's world, Lila's world, was shattered all over again. And as the riders closed in, their leader, Tommy Tanner, gave a chilling laugh. Well, looks like we have ourselves a real showdown, don't we?" The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over the rugged hills that surrounded the ranch. The air had grown thick with the dust of old secrets and fresh decisions. The barn door creaked as Lila stepped into the fading light, her figure silhouetted against the soft orange glow of the evening sky. Cassidy stood beside her, his small hand clutching hers tightly, his face still pale from the tension that had gripped him since the arrival of Tommy Tanner. Lila could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. The promise she had made to Cassidy, the legacy of her husband, and the future of the land all hung in the balance. She hadn't come to this point by accident. This moment had been years in making, shaped by grief, by love, and by the silent, unspoken ties to a ranch that had witnessed both her deepest joys and her darkest hours. Luke Matthews stood just outside the barn, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the land as though he were trying to decipher the wind itself. He had always been a man of action, but now, as he turned his gaze toward Lila, there was a new depth to his look. The fire in his eyes had been tempered by compassion, the battle-worn edges of his soul softened by the presence of a woman who, despite everything, had kept fighting. She had come to sell the ranch, to let go of everything that had tied her to the past. But now, with Luke standing by her side, the choice didn't feel so clear anymore. "Lila," Luke's voice was low, but it carried across the yard. "You've got a future ahead of you, and I know you don't need me to tell you how hard it's been. But this land, your land, could still be something else. You don't have to walk away from it." Lila swallowed, her emotions threatening to break free as the memories of her late husband, Michael, flashed in her mind. He had loved this place, breathed life into it, and had shared his dreams with her beneath these same skies. She had promised him she would keep the land alive, but at what cost? Could she truly give it up, knowing that the weight of this place would drag her down with it? "I don't know any more," she admitted softly, her voice quivering. "Every part of me says that I should just let go, but the truth is, I don't know what I'd be letting go of. What would I be without this land?" Luke stepped closer, his boots stirring the dust beneath his feet. He was a man who had lived through storms of his own, guilt, fear, loneliness, but he had never let them dictate his choices. Instead, he had always fought, always persevered. He wasn't going to let Lila make her decision alone. You be you, Lila, and that's enough. It's not the land that makes you who you are. It's the strength you carry inside. Her heart pounded as the words hit her. Luke had always been a steady hand in the chaos, but there was something more now, something she couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was the way he had shown up time and time again, when she needed him the most. Perhaps it was the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in her life that had been shaped by loss. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the way he had made her believe that maybe there was still something worth fighting for in this world beyond the ranch. Lila met his gaze, her eyes searching his, and for the first time in a long while, she saw a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this battle, and for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare her. Cassidy's small voice broke through the silence between them. "Are we going to stay here, Mama? Can we stay with Luke?" Lila looked down at her son, her heart tightening in her chest. His words were innocent, but they spoke volumes. The choice wasn't just hers anymore. Cassidy had come to rely on Luke too, just as she had. "Maybe," she whispered, her eyes softening as she crouched to his level. "Maybe we will." Before she could speak further, the sound of hooves disrupted the quiet evening. A figure appeared on horseback, riding fast across the open field toward the ranch. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was before he even dismounted. Tommy Tanner, the man who had arrived with intentions that no one, not even Lila, fully understood. The man who had been part of her past, and now seemed to be tangled in the future. "Lila," Tommy called, his voice strained with frustration as he neared the barn. "You can't be serious about this. You can't just hand this place over to him." He motioned to Luke, his tone bitter. "This land belongs to the Tanner name, not to some drifter." Luke's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle tightening of his jaw. He stepped forward, his body language calm, controlled, but with an undeniable presence. "I think it's time to let go of what's in the past, Tommy," Luke said, his voice steady. "The land isn't yours to claim anymore. It's hers. Let her make the choice." Tommy glared at him, but his eyes flicked to Lila, the unspoken tension thick in the air. "You're making a mistake, Lila. I told you this wouldn't end well." "I'm not making a mistake, Tommy," Lila said quietly, her voice firm. "I know what I need to do." Tommy's face darkened with anger, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might make a move toward her. But then he stopped himself, the realization dawning that this battle was already lost. "You'll regret this," he spat, before turning his horse around and riding off, disappearing into the dusk. Lila stood there, her heart racing, her hands trembling at her sides. She had made the decision. The land, the ranch, the legacy. It didn't have to be her burden to bear alone anymore. Turning back to Luke and Cassidy, Lila felt the weight on her shoulders lift just a little. There was still so much uncertainty in her life. But one thing had become abundantly clear. They would face the future together. As Lila and Luke stood side by side, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the hills, a new chapter was about to begin. But as they turned toward the barn, a flicker of movement caught their eye. Someone or something was out there in the shadows, watching them. And just as the wind shifted, carrying a whisper through the trees, Lila felt the weight of yet another decision bearing down on her. The sun dipped lower, casting the landscape in an eerie twilight glow. But it wasn't just a fading light that made the air feel heavy. A sense of foreboding lingered, as though the land itself knew the weight of the decision Lila had made. She and Luke stood together at the edge of the barn, their silhouettes framed against the darkening sky. Cassidy's small hand tugged at Lila's sleeve, drawing her attention. "Who's that?" Cassidy whispered, his voice barely audible. Lila's gaze sharpened. She had hoped the evening would pass in quiet peace. But the figure emerging from the shadows was not someone she had expected. The outline of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, moved toward them with deliberate steps. The soft crunch of boots against dirt was the only sound that cut through the stillness. Her heart tightened. She knew immediately that this wasn't anyone they had invited. The figure was too familiar, yet too foreign. Lila's breath caught in her chest. "Stay close," she said softly, her hand instinctively moving to the small revolver tucked beneath her belt. Luke was already stepping toward the figure, his body instinctively moving into position, a silent protector. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders. The same unease had been gnawing at her since the moment Tommy Tanner had left. She didn't know what this new arrival wanted, but she wasn't about to let it throw everything they had fought for into chaos. The man stepped closer, and the last remnants of the sun illuminated his face, revealing the hardened features of someone who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. "You're not welcome here," Luke said firmly, but with a calm that betrayed no fear. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes cold but sharp. Lila felt an unsettling chill run down her spine. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, his voice gruff but steady. "I'm just here to deliver a message." Lila's mind raced. Who could this be? Her heart pounded with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "A message?" Lila repeated, her voice steady despite the growing unease. "From who?" The man glanced at Luke, then back at Lila, his eyes narrowing. "You'll know soon enough," he replied cryptically. "But not from me. I was just sent to warn you." Lila's grip tightened around the revolver, but her mind was already racing ahead, trying to make sense of the situation. Whoever had sent him was trying to get a message to her. But why? And what did it mean for the promise she had just made? Luke stepped forward, his voice firm. "If you're here to cause trouble, I'll see you off myself." The stranger met Luke's gaze, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a steely resolve. "I'm not here for that. I'm here because what's coming next, you're going to need to be prepared." Lila could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be easy. She exchanged a glance with Luke, and for the first time since making her decision, a seed of doubt planted itself in her mind. What exactly had she gotten herself into? Before she could ask anything further, the man turned and began to walk away, his footsteps as measured as his earlier approach. The setting sun cast long, dark shadows across his retreating form, and just before he disappeared into the encroaching night, he turned his head slightly, as if to speak over his shoulder. "Be ready. It's not just the land you'll be fighting for." The words lingered in the air like a bad omen, sending a shiver down Lila's spine. What did he mean? And more importantly, who else was involved in the strange game she had unknowingly stepped into? Luke took a step toward her, his eyes scanning the distance where the man had disappeared. That didn't feel right. "I know," Lila replied quietly, her voice thick with a mixture of worry and confusion. "But I don't know what to make of it." "I'll keep watch," Luke said, his voice resolute. "We'll stay alert. You're not alone in this." Lila nodded, though a part of her still felt the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her chest. Her heart wasn't just heavy with fear, it was heavy with guilt. She had made the decision to keep the ranch, but now it seemed as though the land was about to make the decision for her. With one final glance toward the distant hills, Luke turned back toward the barn and Lila, his face hardening with determination. "Let's make sure no one else comes near tonight," he said quietly. Lila nodded, her heart racing, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't going to give up the ranch without a fight. Not now. Not when she had so much to lose. As the night deepened, Lila and Luke stood vigilant, the moonlight casting a cold glow over the barnyard. The land was quiet, but it felt as though it was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the stars, something was waiting, something that would change everything. Would Lila's promise to herself hold up against the encroaching danger? Would she and Luke be able to protect what they had fought for? The wind howled across the land, a relentless force, as the moon cast a cold light across the ranch. Lila stood at the edge of the barn, her hands resting on the wood, her mind clouded with thoughts of the mysterious man's warning. She had never imagined that her decision to keep the land would lead her down this treacherous path. But now, with every passing hour, the reality of it was sinking in deeper. Luke was already preparing the barn for whatever was coming. He had a quiet intensity about him, always aware, always vigilant. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Lila could see it in his eyes. He didn't speak it aloud, but she knew he was thinking the same thing. They were no longer just defending their land. They were fighting for something much bigger. Suddenly, she heard the distinct sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, not the hurried gallop of a rider chasing something, but the steady beat of someone approaching with purpose. Lila's heart stopped for a moment. Luke stiffened beside her, his hand immediately going to his sidearm. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice rough. Lila didn't argue, but she didn't move either. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. The rider came into view, another man, but this one was different. He rode with an air of authority, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, casting deep shadows over his features. But Lila could see the gleam of a badge on his chest. He wasn't just some rancher or traveler. He was law. The man stopped a few yards away, his horse stamping the ground with metallic clink. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy sound. Lila's breath caught in her throat. "You're the rancher here?" the man asked, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. He looked at Lila with calculating eyes, his gaze flicking to Luke. "I am," Lila replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. "What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I'm Sheriff Hale," he said, his tone flat, "and I'm here to collect what's mine." Lila's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, collect?" Hale took a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving Lila's face. "I've been sent to repossess this land. The debts your husband left behind were never settled, and I intend to collect whether you like it or not." Luke moved then, his body stepping in front of Lila, his face hardening. "You're not taking anything from her." The sheriff looked at Luke for the first time, sizing him up. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, knowing look. "This doesn't concern you," Hale said. "It does now," Luke replied, his voice low but dangerous. Hale laughed darkly, a sound that echoed through the still night air. "I suggest you step aside. This is official business. You don't want to make it personal." Lila's hand tightened on her revolver, her finger brushing against the cool metal. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the familiar weight of the weapon grounding her, but at the same time, she was filled with doubt. This was the moment everything changed. "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said, stepping closer. "And neither is she." The sheriff studied him, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like the air itself was holding its breath. Lila's fingers trembled as she gripped her gun. But before she could make a move, something else broke the silence, a soft, sharp whistle from a distance. Lila's eyes flicked to the horizon, her stomach dropping. In the distance, a dozen riders appeared, dark figures against a moonlit sky, their horses thundering across the dirt with a powerful speed. They were too fast to be friendly, too many to be anything but trouble. Luke's body tensed, his eyes scanning the riders. "We don't have much time." Sheriff Hale turned to face the approaching riders. "I didn't expect you to make this difficult," he said, more to himself than to Luke or Lila. "But it looks like this land is going to cost more than I thought." Lila's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. What was happening? Who were these people? And what did it all mean for her and her land? Luke moved into position, his gun ready. But Lila could see that he was thinking, calculating. His hand was steady, but she could tell he was waiting for the right moment. She felt the same anticipation. This wasn't just a fight for the land anymore. It was a fight for everything they had. The riders closed in, their faces still hidden in shadow. The tension was palpable, and Lila could feel the weight of the decision hanging on her shoulders. She had made her choice to keep the land, but now, with danger closing in, she had to make another choice, fight or run. She looked at Luke, his face set in determination. She had promised to protect the land, but she had never expected it would come down to this. The wind howled across the land, a relentless force, as the moon cast a cold light across the ranch. Lila stood at the edge of the barn, her hands resting on the wood, her mind clouded with thoughts of the mysterious man's warning. She had never imagined that her decision to keep the land would lead her down this treacherous path. But now, with every passing hour, the reality of it was sinking in deeper. Luke was already preparing the barn for whatever was coming. He had a quiet intensity about him, always aware, always vigilant. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Lila could see it in his eyes. He didn't speak aloud, but she knew he was thinking the same thing. They were no longer just defending their land. They were fighting for something much bigger. Suddenly, she heard the distinct sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate, not the hurried gallop of a rider chasing something, but the steady beat of someone approaching with purpose. Lila's heart stopped for a moment. Luke stiffened beside her, his hand immediately going to his sidearm. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice rough. Lila didn't argue, but she didn't move either. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. The rider came into view, another man, but this one was different. He rode with an air of authority, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, casting deep shadows over his features. But Lila could see the gleam of a badge on his chest. He wasn't just some rancher or traveler. He was law. The man stopped a few yards away, his horse stamping the ground with a metallic clink. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy sound. Lila's breath caught in her throat. "You're the rancher here?" the man asked, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. He looked at Lila with calculating eyes, his gaze flicking to Luke. "I am," Lila replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. "What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I'm Sheriff Hale," he said, his tone flat, "and I'm here to collect what's mine." Lila's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, collect?" Hale took a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving Lila's face. "I've been sent to repossess this land. The debts your husband left behind were never settled, and I intend to collect whether you like it or not." Luke moved then, his body stepping in front of Lila, his face hardening. "You're not taking anything from her." The sheriff looked at Luke for the first time, sizing him up. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, knowing look. "This doesn't concern you," Hale said. "It does now," Luke replied, his voice low but dangerous. Hale laughed darkly, a sound that echoed through the still night air. "I suggest you step aside. This is official business. You don't want to make it personal." Lila's hand tightened on her revolver, her finger brushing against the cool metal. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the familiar weight of the weapon grounding her, but at the same time, she was filled with doubt. This was the moment everything changed. "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said, stepping closer. "And neither is she." The sheriff studied him, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like the air itself was holding its breath. Lila's fingers trembled as she gripped her gun. But before she could make a move, something else broke the silence, a soft, sharp whistle from the distance. Lila's eyes flicked to the horizon, her stomach dropping. In the distance, a dozen riders appeared, dark figures against the moonlit sky, their horses thundering across the dirt with a powerful speed. They were too fast to be friendly, too many to be anything but trouble. Luke's body tensed, his eyes scanning the riders. "We don't have much time." Sheriff Hale turned to face the approaching riders. "I didn't expect you to make this difficult," he said, more to himself than to Luke or Lila. "But it looks like this land is going to cost more than I thought." Lila's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. What was happening? Who were these people? And what did it all mean for her and her land? Luke moved into position, his gun ready, but Lila could see that he was thinking, calculating. His hand was steady, but she could tell he was waiting for the right moment. She felt the same anticipation. This wasn't just a fight for the land anymore. It was a fight for everything they had. The riders closed in, their faces still hidden in shadow. The tension was palpable, and Lila could feel the weight of the decision hanging on her shoulders. She had made her choice to keep the land, but now, with danger closing in, she had to make another choice, fight or run. She looked at Luke, his face set in determination. She had promised to protect the land, but she had never expected it would come down to this. The riders were almost upon them. 12 men on horseback, their faces grim and determined. Their horses' hooves kicked up a storm of dust, their presence like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Lila's breath hitched, her mind racing. There was nowhere to run and no way to fight them all. Sheriff Hale stood silently, watching, as the riders drew near, their intentions clear in every motion. His gaze met Luke's for a brief moment, cold and calculating. "You don't know what you're up against," Hale said, his voice as calm as ever. But beneath that calm was something darker. He knew the weight of the men coming. They were his backup, his muscle. Luke stood between Lila and the sheriff, his posture tense, muscles coiled for action. "I'll stand against whatever you bring," he said. His eyes never left the riders. Lila felt her pulse quicken, but there was no turning back now. She glanced at Luke, seeing the resolve in his eyes. It mirrored her own. They had come this far together, and they weren't going to let it all crumble. As the riders closed in, Luke gave a single nod to Lila. She understood the message. Be ready. The sheriff didn't wait for them to make the first move. He lifted his hand and nodded toward the riders. At that signal, they drew their guns, the metallic sound of weapons being cocked echoing in the air. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. Her fingers gripped the handle of her revolver tightly, the cold steel grounding her. This was no longer just about the land. It was about survival. It was about keeping her promise to herself, to Luke, and to the ranch. Luke's eyes flicked to the riders. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "And now you'll pay for it." Without warning, one of the riders, a large man with a thick beard and piercing blue eyes, spurred his horse forward, his revolver aimed straight at Luke. The tension in the air snapped like a taut rope. But Luke was faster. In a split second, he dove to the side, the sharp crack of gunfire ringing through the air. The bullet missed by inches, but Luke had already rolled, landing on his feet behind a large haystack for cover. Lila didn't hesitate. She pulled her revolver from its holster, her fingers shaking but determined. The rider who had aimed at Luke was already reloading, unaware that she was now in his sights. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the bullet hitting the rider's shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse with a howl of pain. He crashed to the ground, groaning in pain as his gun clattered to the dirt. One down, but there were still 11 more to face. Luke moved swiftly, firing shots into the night, his every movement calculated. He was a blur of action, a cowboy driven by instinct and training. His shots found their marks, sending another rider tumbling from his horse, the man's scream echoing in the open plains. The battle had begun. Lila, her heart racing, stayed behind cover, keeping low and firing whenever she could. Her mind was focused, her body moving almost instinctively. This was a fight for survival, and she wouldn't back down. But the sheriff had not moved. He stood calmly, watching the chaos unfold, his face impassive. He had been here before. He knew the risks, and he was content to let the riders do the heavy lifting. But then, something shifted. One of the riders, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, saw the sheriff standing idly by. He spurred his horse forward, his intentions clear. He was going to take Luke down, with or without the sheriff's help. The man's horse thundered forward, his gun aimed at Luke's back. Lila's heart stopped for a moment. If she didn't act, Luke wouldn't see it coming. She didn't hesitate. Lila stepped out from behind cover, her gun aimed and steady. She squeezed the trigger again. The rider jerked back, his chest struck by the bullet, sending him spiraling from his horse in a cloud of dust. But the damage had been done. The distraction had given the remaining riders a chance to regroup, and now they were closing in from all sides. Luke glanced over at Lila, his eyes narrowed, knowing that the battle was far from over. "Stay with me?" Luke shouted, his voice carrying over chaos. Lila nodded, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't know how much longer they could hold out, but she wasn't about to stop now. She had come this far. And then, just as the riders seemed to be closing in, a sudden burst of gunfire rang out from behind them. The riders faltered, confusion flashing across their faces. From behind the barn came a familiar figure, another rider, but this one was different. It was a woman, dressed in dark clothing, her long black hair flowing behind her. Her horse was a shadow against the moonlight, and her revolver smoked with the heat of her recent shots. The Apache woman had returned. With deadly precision, she took out 2 more riders, her movement swift and fluid like a shadow in the night. The remaining riders hesitated, realizing they were no longer facing just Luke and Lila. They were facing something far more dangerous. Luke, ever the opportunist, took advantage of the chaos. He moved swiftly, his gun blazing, dropping another rider from his horse. And then, with a final, decisive shot, he took down the last of the riders, leaving the remaining few disarmed and retreating into the night. The battlefield fell silent. Only the sound of the wind and the occasional groan of the fallen horses filled the air. Lila's heart was pounding in her chest, her body tense with the aftermath of the battle. She looked at Luke, her eyes wide with relief, but also with something else. Something deeper, something that had shifted between them during the chaos. The Apache woman slowly dismounted, her eyes flicking between Luke and Lila. She nodded to them both, her face unreadable. "You're welcome," she said simply, before disappearing back into the shadows from which she came. Luke turned to Lila, his face hardening as he walked toward her. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not yet." Lila looked up at him, her heart still racing. "What happens now?" she asked. Luke took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We rebuild," he said, his voice full of determination. "We protect what's ours." And as they stood together, in the midst of the wreckage, they both knew that the fight for the land was far from over. But together, they would face whatever came next. As they walked toward the barn, Lila's heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play than just land or ranching. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something buried in the land itself, something she hadn't yet fully understood. The shadow of doubt lingered, but so did the promise. And as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the land they had fought for, Lila knew that this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey. The rising sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and gold, casting a calm light over the battlefield. The once chaotic air now settled into a quiet, eerie stillness, broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the wind sweeping through the valley. The land that had been fought over, bled for, and nearly lost now lay at the heart of an uncertain future. Luke and Lila stood side by side, taking in the aftermath of the battle. Their bodies were weary, but their spirits were more resolute than ever. The dust and smoke still lingered in the air, a reminder of the night's chaos. Yet, as the first rays of dawn touched their faces, there was a quiet sense of victory, but also an unspoken understanding that they were not yet free. Lila turned to Luke, her heart racing for reasons far deep in the battle they had just fought. She had seen strength, courage, and loyalty in him, qualities she hadn't expected in the world she had grown to distrust. He had kept his promise to protect her, but now she faced her own dilemma. Would she keep her promise to him? "Luke," she began, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What now? What do we do after this?" Luke met her gaze, his expression softening as he stepped closer. There was no arrogance in his movements, no pretension, just a man who had fought beside her, just as determined to hold on to what they had. "We rebuild, Lila," he said quietly. "We keep the land, but we protect it, and we make sure the people who rely on us never have to face this kind of fight again. And you make the choice you have to make." Lila blinked, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She had always known that this land wasn't just about soil and crops. It was about legacy, about family. She thought she had been prepared to sell it, to walk away, to start anew. But now, she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of the promise she had made to herself. To move on was the right one. The night had changed something in her. She had faced the threat of losing everything, and in the process, she had found something she hadn't even realized was missing: trust. Luke had shown her a side of herself she hadn't known existed, a side that wasn't afraid to fight for what was worth fighting for. But there was still the matter of the land that had caused so much pain, so much bloodshed. She glanced over at the remnants of the fallen riders, their horses scattered across the dusty earth. It was clear that they hadn't been the only ones who had claimed the land as their own, and the thought of more bloodshed haunted her. Could they keep the land, or would it only bring more suffering? Luke's voice broke through her thoughts, warm and steady. Whatever you choose, Lila, you don't have to make it alone. A wave of emotion washed over her. She had always been alone, fighting battles in silence, bearing the weight of the world on her shoulders. But Luke had become a part of her life in ways she hadn't imagined. He was offering her not just protection, but a partnership. I don't know if I can make this choice, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There's so much at stake, Luke, so many lives. Luke's hand brushed against hers, a simple gesture, but one that sent a surge of warmth through her. You don't have to decide now. We take it one step at a time. We'll face the rest together. The promise was simple, but it held more weight than any oath she could have imagined. Lila's heart fluttered, caught in the pull of uncertainty and hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could trust someone completely. As Luke and Lila began to walk back toward the barn, the distant sound of hooves once again caught their attention. The tension in the air returned, a familiar unease creeping over them. Lila's hand instinctively reached for the gun at her side, but Luke stopped her with a soft, yet firm grip on her wrist. Wait, Luke said, his voice steady. It's not them. Lila followed his gaze, her heart in her throat, as a lone rider emerged from the horizon, riding slowly toward them. The rider was familiar, an Apache woman, her long black hair flowing in the wind, her posture regal and unwavering. The same woman who had helped them during the battle. As she drew nearer, her face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different about her now. She wasn't just a warrior anymore. She was someone who had fought beside them, someone who had become part of their story. She halted her horse a few feet away, her eyes flicking from Luke to Lila. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she regarded them both for a long moment, as if weighing their every move. You fought hard for this land, the Apache woman finally said, her voice deep and steady. But you must understand that it is not just land. It is part of something much greater. The blood spilled here, both yours and theirs. It cannot be washed away so easily. Luke's jaw tightened. He knew the weight of her words. The land wasn't just earth, it was history. And they had become part of that history, for better or worse. Lila's gaze softened as she looked at the Apache woman, understanding something she hadn't before. She wasn't just a stranger. She was someone who had seen the same struggles they faced, someone who had fought for something larger than herself. We can't change what's been done, Lila said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But we can make sure it doesn't happen again. The Apache woman nodded, her expression unreadable. She turned her horse around, ready to leave. But before she did, she gave Lila one last, lingering look. You've made your choice, the Apache woman said quietly. But be warned, the past does not let go so easily. With that, she turned and rode off into the distance, leaving Lila and Luke standing together, their future uncertain but their bond unbreakable. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Luke and Lila sat together on the porch of the ranch house. The dust had settled, but the battle, both physical and emotional, was far from over. Yet, in the quiet stillness of the evening, there was a sense of peace. The land was theirs, for now. The promise was theirs, too. I'll stand by you, Luke said, his voice low but full of resolve. No matter what comes next. Lila smiled, her heart full of gratitude and something more, something deeper. I won't let you down, she whispered, her eyes locked on his, her hand resting gently on his. As the evening stars began to twinkle in the sky, the weight of the world didn't seem quite so heavy. Together, they could face anything. And whatever came next, they would face it as partners, united by the land they fought for and the love that had blossomed in the heat of battle. As the night deepened, a lone rider appeared on the horizon once more. They didn't see him at first, but his silhouette was unmistakable. The figure was familiar, one they thought had disappeared into the dust of the past. Luke and Lila shared a look, knowing that their journey was far from over. The story of the land, the promise they had made, and the dangers they faced would continue. And with that knowledge, they prepared for what lay ahead, standing together in the quiet, watching the horizon as the future loomed.